Hey family, welcome back to my video. Today we will see, what if Harry Potter joined the anonymous Redux Triwizard tournament? Before we start, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to the original author of this story for granting us permission to use it in our YouTube video. Your generosity is greatly appreciated. The author's creation and the original story's link in the descriptions. Please do check that first. Now enjoy the video. The great hall buzzed with excitement as students gathered for breakfast, the morning light filtering through the enchanted ceiling. Harry, Ron, and Hermione found their usual seats at the Gryffindor table, where plates of toast, eggs, and sausages shimmered invitingly under the golden light of the enchanted candles. Ron immediately began piling his plate high, while Hermione sipped her pumpkin juice, already scanning her timetable for the day. Harry, on the other hand, couldn't stop overhearing the chatter around him. Everyone was talking about the same thing, the Triwizard tournament. The Goblet of Fire had been placed in the entrance hall the previous night, and already, the school was buzzing with speculation about who would be brave enough or mad enough to enter. But for Harry, the idea of entering the tournament felt more like a headache than an adventure. After everything he'd been through in the last 3 years, he had zero interest in risking his neck for a trophy. Think Crumb will enter? Ron asked through a mouthful of eggs, his eyes flicking toward the Durmstrang table, where Victor Crumb sat, barely acknowledging the fanboys and fangirls sneaking glances at him. Definitely, Hermione replied. He's got the experience. He's a world-class seeker. He'd probably be brilliant at the tasks. Harry nodded absently, reaching for some toast. He didn't care who entered, so long as it wasn't him. The last thing he needed was to get involved in another life-or-death competition. His mind wandered back to the age line Dumbledore had drawn around the Goblet of Fire, an enchanted barrier to keep students under 17 from entering. Ron, apparently sensing a lull in the conversation, suddenly leaned forward, his face lighting up with excitement. "I've been thinking, though," he said, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "What if we figured out how to get past the age line? Just for fun, you know?" Harry raised an eyebrow, lowering his goblet. "Fun," he echoed, the words sounding ridiculous in his mouth. "You do remember that people have died in this tournament, right?" Ron waved his hand dismissively. Yeah, but Dumbledore's here, isn't he? It's bound to be safer this time. Anyway, there's got to be some way to sneak in. What if we, I don't know, just jumped over the line?" Dumbledore probably didn't think of people, jumping. Harry stared at Ron, dumbfounded. Hermione snorted into her pumpkin juice, trying and failing to hide her laughter. "You've got to be kidding, Ron," she said, shaking her head. "It's a magical barrier, not a piece of string you can just hop over." Ron looked mildly offended. All right, but there's got to be some way past it." Harry sighed. The truth was, he was a bit curious not about entering, but about how the line worked. "Could you really trick it?" "Well, if you're so keen," he muttered, poking at his toast, "why not just get someone older to put your name in for you? Someone who's already over 17. Ron's eyes widened as if Harry had just revealed the secret to eternal life. "That's it," he said, slamming his hand on the table with such enthusiasm that the nearby jug of pumpkin juice wobbled dangerously. "That's brilliant. Fred or George could do it. I mean, they're already planning on getting in somehow. Why wouldn't they help us?" Harry wasn't sure how to respond. He hadn't actually intended for Ron to take the idea seriously. He didn't want to enter the tournament. But now Ron was looking at him as though he'd solved all their problems. "I was just saying it could work. Not that I'm interested." "Come on, Harry," Ron pressed, grinning. "It'd be amazing. Imagine you, me, champions of Hogwarts. We could show everyone up." "Or," Harry replied dryly, "we could both end up in the hospital wing. Or worse." Before Ron could argue, Fred and George appeared out of nowhere, sliding into the seats across from them. "Did someone say champions?" Fred asked, a mischievous glint in his eye. He reached for a slice of toast and took a bite, as though he hadn't a care in the world. "I think I heard something about sneaking past Dumbledore's age line," George added, smirking. "And here we thought you lot didn't have the guts." Ron immediately perked up. "You heard Harry's idea, didn't you? About someone older entering for us?" Fred raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Interesting," he said, leaning forward. "But we've got something even better." George pulled a small, corked vial from his pocket and set it on the table between them. It was filled with a shimmering, silvery liquid that seemed to glow faintly in the candlelight. Aging potion, George said proudly. Couple drops of this, and you'll be old enough to cross the line. Harry blinked, staring at the vial. He immediately felt a sinking feeling in his stomach. No way, he said firmly, pushing his plate aside. I'm not interested. I don't care how much magic or potion or whatever you come up with. I'm not risking my life for a stupid competition. Ron's face fell, and even Fred and George seemed a little taken aback by Harry's flat-out refusal. Come on, Harry, Fred urged, his grin faltering slightly. Where's your sense of adventure? Gone. After nearly getting killed by a basilisk, dementors, and a Death Eater, Harry replied, his voice hard. Seriously, no thanks. You can keep your potion. Well, your loss, George said happily, pocketing the vial with a shrug. But if you change your mind, you know where to find us. Fred grinned again. We'll be crossing that line by tonight. We'll even save you a spot, Harry, in case you get bored of playing it safe. Fred and George sauntered away, their excitement apparent. Are you serious, Harry? Ron asked, his disappointment clear. You're really not going to try? Harry met Ron's eyes, trying to make him understand. No, I'm not, he said quietly. I don't want to be a champion, Ron. I don't care about all the glory and stuff. It's just, I've had enough near-death experiences to last a lifetime. Hermione, who had been silently observing the whole exchange, nodded approvingly. Good for you, Harry, she said. It's refreshing to hear someone with some common sense for once. Ron groaned, shoveling more eggs onto his plate. Fine, but you'll regret it when I'm the one winning eternal glory, and you're sitting on the sidelines with Hermione. I think I'll manage, Harry replied. As they finished up breakfast, Ron took off heading for the bathroom, and almost on cue Hermione piped up, "Wait here," before running off. With a sigh, he settled himself on a windowsill, his gaze drifting to the castle grounds beyond the frosted panes. There was a chill in the air, but it did little to settle the growing restlessness in his chest. The Yule Ball, the looming second task, and now Hermione had darted off on some errand, leaving him to wait. As always, he reached into his bag and pulled out one of the library books Hermione had insisted he borrow. He wasn't really in the mood for more theory. His head was already buzzing with enough to fill 3 days of exams, but he absent-mindedly flipped through the pages anyway. Something about the intent required for summoning charms, and the subtle differences between silencing and suppression spells. The words blurred in front of him as his mind wandered, focusing instead on the muffled voices coming from a nearby group of students. Their conversation, though in hushed tones, was hard to ignore. Are you entering? A voice asked, the accent immediately giving away its owner as one of the Beauxbatons students. Of course. Why else would I be in this dreary place? Replied another, her voice dripping with disdain. Harry glanced up over the top of his book. A small group of younger Hogwarts students had gathered near the large arched window, clearly captivated by the figure standing in the center. Fleur Delacour. Her silver blonde hair shimmered in the light, cascading over her robes like a waterfall. She was surrounded by admirers, both Hogwarts and Beauxbaton students alike, all hanging on her every word. Her expression was effortlessly aloof, as if she couldn't care less about the attention. Yet Harry could tell by the slight tilt of her chin and the faint smirk on her lips that she was basking in it. Harry rolled his eyes and tried to refocus on the book, but found himself involuntarily mimicking her French pronunciation under his breath. This dreary place. Excusez-moi, came a sharp voice. Harry froze, his eyes widening as the murmuring around him stopped. Fleur was looking directly at him, her cool blue eyes narrowed in mild irritation. The crowd of admirers went silent, their eyes darting between Fleur and Harry as though anticipating a showdown. What? Harry said, blinking in confusion. You have something to say about me being chosen as champion? Fleur's voice was smooth, but there was an edge to it now, her French accent more pronounced in her annoyance. Harry flushed under her piercing gaze. No, I just dashed, he stammered, trying to find the right words. I just meant, I don't really need to be champion. It's not my thing. The corner of Fleur's mouth twitched, though whether in amusement or disdain, Harry couldn't tell. She flicked her hair over her shoulder with a practiced motion and let out a short, derisive laugh. Ah, she said, turning slightly back to her entourage. So, he is a coward, then? The group of students tittered, and Harry felt heat rising to his face. His hands clenched in a fist in his lap, and he suddenly felt very small, sitting there on the windowsill, while Fleur stood tall, bathed in the glow of admiration. A sharp retort rose in his throat before he could stop himself. I just find it a bit fanciful someone from France talking about bravery, he said, his voice tight with frustration. You know, given your country's history with adversity. For a second, there was silence. Then, to his surprise, a few of the younger students stifled giggles, their eyes flicking nervously between Harry and Fleur. Fleur's expression froze, her eyes narrowing. She turned fully towards him, her chin lifting as she fixed him with a look that was half challenge, half amusement. Then perhaps you should enter, she said, her voice low and dangerous. Show us some of that famous English courage, non? Harry stared at her, his heart thudding painfully in his chest. He wasn't even old enough to enter the Triwizard tournament, but something in her tone, in the way her eyes glinted in the afternoon light, made him feel like he couldn't back down. Not in front of her. Before he could fully process what he was doing, Harry found himself reaching for a scrap of parchment from the notebook beside him. His hand moved on autopilot, scribbling his name and Hogwarts onto the corner. He tore off the paper, heart pounding, and thrust it toward her, trying to maintain an air of nonchalance. In reality, his hand was shaking slightly. Fleur raised an elegant eyebrow, her lips curling into a small, dangerous smile. She didn't say anything as she stepped forward and plucked the note from his hand, her fingers brushing his for the briefest moment. Harry felt a jolt at the contact, his pulse quickening. Without a word, Fleur turned on her heel and strode gracefully toward the goblet of fire, her silver hair shimmering behind her like moonlight on water. Harry watched, his mouth dry, as she stretched her arm out over the ancient artifact and casually dropped his slip of paper into the flames. The goblet flared briefly, accepting the offering without protest. A wave of dread crashed over Harry. What had he just done? His heart thudded in his chest, his mind replaying the moment in slow motion. He knew it was just a scrap of paper, and that it wouldn't count, but there was still something final about seeing it disappear into the goblet. Fleur glanced back at him, her eyes twinkling with mischief, before she melded back into the crowd of admirers, who were now buzzing with excitement. Harry's hand remained outstretched for a moment longer, his mind still catching up with what had just happened. He felt exhilarated? Maybe. Or maybe just stupid. Before he could dwell on it any further, there was a sharp poke in his side. Harry! Hermione's voice cut through the fog in his brain. Harry blinked and turned to see Hermione standing beside him. Hi, he said quickly, dropping his hand to his side and trying to look innocent. What are you acting so shifty for? Hermione said, her eyebrows furrowed. I wasn't, Harry protested, his face heating up again. I just ran into the French delegation. Hermione raised an eyebrow. Well, whatever, you dork. Come on, we need to get to class. Harry nodded, grabbing his books and standing up a little too quickly. As they walked away, he cast one last glance over his shoulder, half expecting Fleur to be watching him. He didn't see her. Harry didn't really want to admit to Hermione what had happened, knowing what the reaction would be. Eventually, before breakfast the next day, he finally told them what had happened. So, you actually tricked someone from the French delegations to enter your name into the goblet? That is legendary. Ron had been repeating the same question since Harry had told them what had happened the afternoon prior. He carried the same awestruck look from their dormitories all the way to the Great Hall, where they were headed for breakfast. It's stupid. Harry, what if the goblet chooses you? A deep feeling of sick lurched in his stomach, a feeling Harry had experienced almost nonstop ever since his name was entered. It can't? I'm 14, and I'm not even that good at magic and stuff? It would be insanity. You're basically guaranteed to be chosen, mate. Nobody has done more for the school than you. Nobody has done more dangerous stuff either. The feeling in the pit of his stomach worsened. Actually, I think Ron is right, Harry. Think about it. You've literally been the champion of Godric Gryffindor not 2 years ago. That was a much bigger deal than this stupid competition. Yes, but there is not a single student in this school that has produced a Patronus, nor actually repelled a Dementor, let alone 100 of them. Yes, but you've faced you-know-who. Twice, Ron added. By the time they arrived at the Great Hall, Harry's shoulders hung, so low his knuckles would soon touch the floor, like some lanky depressed sloth that somehow managed to learn to walk upright. Breakfast was no better. At some point, the French witch that had entered his name came over to chat for some reason, an occasion that had Ron choke on his toast more than once, earning him several disgusted looks by the French girl. Hermione, on the other hand, managed to convey, through very unsubtle hints, that the girl was less than welcome at their table. The French girl, however, if she even notices, did not let on for 1 second that she did. For Harry, this was very awkward, most of all because as he remembered their last interaction, she hadn't seemed to enjoy his company whatsoever. If that was the case, however, she hid any animosity behind a sparkling white smile the entire time. The school classes went about as smoothly as his morning had for him. Hermione had become oddly quiet towards Harry after breakfast. It would have been a welcome distraction to talk to her, because whenever he was left with his own thoughts at the moment, he found himself distracted by thoughts of having to wrestle trolls or duel seventh years, and just in general spectacularly fail in front of a very large audience. Later the same week, Hermione approached him again, having spent some time in the library. Putting your name in the goblet constitutes a binding magical contract. The rest is not as straightforward. Harry merely shrugged. He had decided on taking a walk by the lake with the express intent of not thinking about the tournament for a moment. Ron gave Harry an amused sideways glance. Hermione pressed on, unperturbed. To enter into a magical agreement, one can do so in a number of ways. The simplest, most straightforward would be to simply and, under your own name, enter into a magically enforced agreement with another party. This would constitute a direct magical contract. That would have been if you put your own name into the goblet by yourself. A binding magical agreement. So, I'm good then? Harry asked desperately. Hermione ignored his question and kept reading aloud instead. Another way, and which is what seems to have transpired here, is that you enter into a magically enforced agreement in your own name, but through the use of an intermediary. This also constitutes a valid magical contract. Another mean is to have your name put down and entered by a third party. This is more complicated. If the contracting party, that is you, Mr. Potter, through conclusive action fulfills that contract, you are bound by the agreement as if you entered it yourself. If, however, you do not acknowledge the agreement through conclusive action, the magical contract is broken. It is, however, the case that it is upon pain of the intermediary. I understood half of those words, Ron stated somewhat proudly. Hermione sighed, as if it all was understandable for a toddler. If your name is entered by someone else and you chose not to compete, the person that entered you is the one who breaks the contract, not you. Oh, so Harry doesn't have to compete? Not unless he wants that French girl to suffer horrific consequences because of his own cowardice. Harry felt himself squirm. Hermione spoke with her face stuffed inside the heavy tome. Harry glanced over and was very grateful he didn't have to decipher the very old-looking scripture. Her head popped out of the book again. This goblet thing is dark. I can't understand why they would ever allow it around students. Why? A contractual default seems to basically make you a squib. I don't even know what most of these words mean, but it sounds awful. Oligophrenia, apoplexia, epitaxis, expiration, horrors. It just says horrors. I definitely do not know any of those words, Ron stated confidently. Harry nodded his agreement. So, if my name comes out, I've got no choice, got it? Not a question of if, mate. Even Ron seemed less enthused about Harry entering after learning about the potential consequences the goblet offered anyone who suffered a change of hearts. They didn't speak the rest of the way to the Great Hall, no doubt all three imagining just how bad it would be to live the rest of one's life suffering from epitaxis, whatever that was. They hung around the lake for another while, and Harry was grateful their conversations for once did not center around semi-dark objects capable of ensnaring students in ancient, binding magical contractual troubles. The sun had set a long time ago when they saw a crowd filing out of the French delegation's carriage, heading towards the castle. Oh, the feast! We should hurry, Ron said. This was the ceremony where the champions would be announced. They made their way over to follow the group of French students. To their left, the Durmstrang students filed in Oswell. Ooh, there is that seeker, Hermione whispered. Crumb, Ron added in the same hushed tone. The Durmstrang group was headed by Karkaroff and Crumb. Ron looked ecstatic, but they did not acknowledge their existence. When they entered the Great Hall, they were clearly the last to arrive. The large room was candlelit with carved heads of pumpkins floating high above the tables. The goblet of fire had been moved and now stood in front of Dumbledore's chair at the teacher's table. "Who do you think it's going to be?" asked an enthusiastic George. Ron shot George an enigmatic look and replied, "Harry." Hermione shot Ron an angry look. George's eyes widened. Fred seemed to intuitively feel his attention was warranted, and George immediately said, "Our brother has beans to spill, it seems, dear Fred." "Pray tell, dear Ron." Hermione cut in, trying to sound severe, but the light mood seemed to get to her somewhat, because she sounded mostly amused. "Harry's name is in the goblet." Fred's eyes sparkled. Harry sighed defeatedly. The feast seemed to drag on for much longer than it usually did. Fred and George whispered conspiratorially the entire time, and by the time it came towards the end, judging by the curious looks from his housemates, most everyone in Gryffindor had been told. Harry couldn't tell if he wanted his name to come out because for everyone to know and him not getting picked seemed somewhat embarrassing, or if he just wanted to disappear and maybe return start of next semester, while clear of all this tournament business. Either way, this was categorically the least enjoyable feast Harry had been to in all his years of Hogwarts. Harry simply wanted the plates to clear and for Dumbledore to announce that the tournament had been cancelled. At long last, the golden plates were again empty and immaculate. The noise of the hall died down, and Dumbledore rose to address them. On either side of him, Professor Karkaroff and Madame Maxime looked as tense and expectant as anyone. Ludo Bagman was beaming and winking at various students. Harry felt like he was being watched and eyed the tables, only to catch the silver-haired French witch smiling at him. She mouthed something at him, likely in French because Harry struggled to make out the message. Before he could return the communication, however, a sharp elbow from Hermione reminded him that his headmaster was to speak. He returned his attention to Dumbledore. "Well, it is time for the goblet to announce its decision," said Dumbledore. "Any second now, but in the meantime, would the champion-elects please head into that chamber?" He waved his arm towards a door behind him. He took out his wand and gave a great sweeping wave with it. At once, all the candles except those inside the carved pumpkins were extinguished, turning the great hall very dramatic in its lighting. The goblet of fire alone shone bright in the large hall. Everyone watched, waiting, and suddenly, the flames inside the goblet turned red. A tongue of flame ejected a charred piece of parchment. A gasp drew across the students. Dumbledore caught it and held it by the flame in order to read the note. "The champion of Durmstrang," he read in a clear voice, "is Victor Crumb." A storm of applause and cheering erupted in the hall. Harry saw Victor Crumb rise from the Slytherin table and slouch up toward Dumbledore. He turned right, walked along the staff table, and disappeared through the door into the next chamber. "Bravo, Victor!" boomed Karkaroff so loudly that everyone could hear him, even over all the applause. "Knew you had it in you." The clapping and chatting died down. Now everyone's attention was focused again on the goblet, which, seconds later, turned red once more. A second piece of parchment shot out of it, propelled by the flames. "The champion for bows batons," said Dumbledore, "is Fleur Delacour." "It's her, Ron!" Harry shouted as the girl who so resembled a Vila got gracefully to her feet, shook back her sheet of silvery blonde hair, and swept up between the Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff tables. "That's the girl that entered my name." "That's ironic," Hermione muttered, and Ron snorted a short laugh in agreement. Harry noted that the Bows Baton students did not seem very supportive, nor happy Fleur was chosen. Two of the girls who had not been selected had dissolved into tears and were sobbing with their heads on their arms. When Fleur Delacour, too, had vanished into the side chamber, silence fell again, but this time it was a silence so stiff with excitement you could almost taste it. The Hogwarts champion next, and the goblet of fire turned red once more. Sparks showered out of it. The tongue of flame shot high into the air, and from its tip Dumbledore pulled the third piece of parchment. "The Hogwarts champion," Dumbledore called, "is Harry Potter." the champion of Hogwarts. Author's note: enjoy, you filthy animals. You did it, Ron screamed ecstatically, and he was joined by the eruption of the entire Gryffindor table that had risen in joyous celebrations, along with, it seemed, the entire school. So great was the noise that Harry almost felt himself lose his balance from his seat at the table. Several hands reached out to pull and push him to his feet. He turned to Hermione, who also looked overjoyed, though Harry felt likely a further small scheme to punish him for entering in the first place. Harry got to his feet, stumbled slightly on his own robes, and to the ear-splitting roar of his peers walked the gap between the Gryffindor and Hufflepuff tables. Hands pelted his back excitedly, but internally he felt numb. He stopped in front of Dumbledore, as if facing an execution, silently hoping for Dumbledore to tell him he in fact could back out, but was merely shown to the door the rest of the champions had entered. Still to a tumultuous roar, Harry moved along the teacher's table. His head was spinning. Harry went through the door out of the Great Hall and found himself in a smaller room. It was a cozy room with a fire roaring in the fireplace opposite the door he just entered. Along the walls, paintings of witches and wizards were celebrating. As he entered the room, Victor Crumb and Fleur Delacour stood next to a large fireplace. Harry walked up to them silently, not quite sure what to say. They seemed to diminish slightly in stature as he approached. The fire had made their silhouette appear very dramatic and impressive when he first entered the dark room. He was taller than both of them, Crumb by only an inch or so. Harry looked from Crumb to Fleur. She was wearing an unreadable expression on her face. He shrugged his shoulders. "You," she said. She eyed him for a long moment, before breaking into a dazzling smile. Harry didn't have anything to say, though, not like he had yesterday. He only managed to look back at her timidly. Already he knew his mouth had written a check he could not clear. He just stood there. It struck him how very much older the other two champions were compared to him. It was hard to look at Fleur. She was almost luminous against the fire. He averted his gaze from her. She opened her mouth, but was interrupted before she could speak. There was the sound of a door opening behind him, and a large group of people came in. Professor Dumbledore, followed by Ludo Bagman, Mr. Crouch, Professor Karkaroff, Madame Maxime, Professor McGonagall, and Professor Snape. He heard the still, tumultuous roar of the students on the other side of the wall before McGonagall closed the door. The merry banter between the judges and the ministry officials stood in stark contrast to the sickening feeling bubbling in the pit of Harry's stomach. The teachers and judges that had entered the room all held the same stiff expression on their faces. Dumbledore turned to Harry and said in a kind voice, "Congratulations. How did you pass my age line?" His tone was pleasant, but the question only deepened the feeling of sick in Harry's stomach. The room was all of a sudden quiet. No doubt all eyes were on Harry's, though for the moment he only saw the piercing blue eyes of the headmaster. He is not of age, but Z line. Harry cringed at hearing the clear voice of Fleur behind him, and immediately regretted having reacted to her speaking. Dumbledore's eyes moved from Harry's to Fleur's, and then back again to Harry. Harry might as well have just told him outright. Harry turned slowly towards the French witch. Fleur's eyes darted from the judges to Harry several times, and Harry kicked himself mentally as he was reminded of what a mess this could turn into. He had told Fleur a lot of things earlier this week, all bollocks of course, and now here he was cashing in his prize. Dumbledore replied to the French witch in a pleasant tone, but kept his eyes on Harry. "He is indeed not of age." I didn't dash," Harry began quietly. Snape made a soft noise of impatient disbelief in the shadows. Fleur cut over him. "You are not of 17? It doesn't matter." The goblet picked Harry. Ludo gave Harry another smile and continued, as if surprising himself. "Also, I am quite certain he is 14. Fleur looked at Harry with incredulity. Harry looked at the fireplace. He felt his cheeks hotten. "You used an older student?" Dumbledore asked somewhat curiously. Harry felt himself shrinking in spite of the light tone of the conversation. He glanced over at Fleur, who looked at him with a stiff expression. Harry didn't want to lie, but he also didn't want to get the French witch into trouble because he tricked her. Handing her the note had been stupid, and accepting it from him had been stupid too for that matter. But there is no reason anyone but him should suffer for it now, he figured. Harry also realized he was still looking into Dumbledore's eyes. Dumbledore held a kind expression. How did you pass my age line? The tone was of pleasant curiosity, though Harry could tell Dumbledore was not used to having to ask questions twice very often. Harry winced at how stupid what he was about to say was, but he steeled himself. I just stood outside the boundary and tossed it. He felt his cheeks hotten. Dumbledore raised his eyebrows. His headmaster didn't push the matter further. Dumbledore simply closed his eyes, smiled, and said as much to himself as to Harry it seemed. Ah, of course. It's always the simplest solution. Congratulations, Harry. Dumbledore's voice left an eerie silence. Harry felt somewhat empty receiving the praise from his headmaster. He tried very hard to not look at Fleur, whom he could feel was looking at him. No one else spoke until Dumbledore broke the silence again. Harry rather thought he was playing the pauses for dramatic effect. His voice was still calm as he spoke. Well then, Potter, I should give you detention for every single weekend of the rest of term. You stupid boy. McGonagall's sudden eruption had most of the room, most of all Harry, whipping around. Minerva! Dumbledore began placatingly, but the deputy headmistress continued angrily. There must be something you can do? Surely, we can't have a 14-year-old. Harry saw and heard in the corner of his eyes Fleur craning her neck to whisper to her headmistress. The giant woman merely waved her away. When Harry returned his attention to his head of house, she had resumed her quiet. Now it was Dumbledore who spoke again. I admit, this is uncharted territory for me. Barty, does he have to compete? Mr. Crouch moved forward into the firelight. Strange shadows moved across his face, though Harry thought he looked markedly better than he had when Harry had met him at the World Cup. The impartial adjudicator chose him. This, however, stands in contrast to our panels of judges. If they were to unanimously decide that the boy is unfit for competition, the word unfit struck Harry as somewhat uncomfortable. He didn't want to be champion, but even less so to be deemed unfit by a panel of judges, even further less in front of the uncommonly pretty French girl. McGonagall spoke again. So, it is decided then? He will not compete. It is up to the judges. Crouch determined. Ah, but of course he must compete. Goblet chose him, cried Madame Maxime. He could die. McGonagall shot back angrily. I quite agree with Maxime. I must insist that we proceed. Karkaroff eyed Harry hungrily as he spoke, his tone smooth and ingratiating. No surprise you'd see the boy in harm's way. Karkaroff, Moody growled from his corner. Dumbledore shot a warning look towards Professor Moody, who quieted down immediately. Mr. Crouch spoke next, his eyes closed. Dumbledore, what's your say? A silence followed. Despite wishing with the entirety of his being just a moment ago there was a way out of all this, he now found himself wishing even more not to be declared unfit. He imagined the look on Malfoy's face as the news spread to him. Harry Potter is unfit to enter the tournament. He cringed inwards. Harry dared a glance at his headmaster. Dumbledore slowly opened his mouth and spoke in a low voice. I will allow Harry Potter to enter the tournament. McGonagall opened her mouth in protest, but did not manage a single syllable. Harry gaped at his headmaster. How on earth did he just allow him to enter? As realization dawned on Harry, he immediately started wishing there was some way for him to get out of the whole thing again, now that at least he didn't have to face the shame of being declared subpar. Amazing. Well, Harry Potter is champion. Bagman beamed as he said it. Karkaroff and Madame Maxime both looked triumphant. Harry figured they were quite happy having a 14-year-old facing their own champions of 17. Dumbledore spoke next, cutting across the discussions that had erupted again around the room. Well then, Mr. Crouch, if you would proceed with the rules. Mr. Crouch didn't miss a single beat. The first task is designed to test your daring, he told Harry, Fleur, and Victor, so you are not going to know what you are to do. Courage in the face of the unknown is an important quality in a wizard. The task is to take place on November the 24th, in front of the other students and a panel of judges. The champions are not allowed to ask for nor accept help of any kind from their teachers to complete the tasks in the tournament. The champions will face the first challenge armed only with their wands. They will receive information about the second task when the first task has come to an end. Owing to the demanding and time-consuming nature of the tournament, the champions are exempt from end-of-year tests. Many precautions have been undertaken to ensure these rules are followed. Do not accept help from your teachers. Mr. Crouch turned to look at Dumbledore. I think that is all, is it not, Albus? I think so, said Dumbledore. Perhaps, Dumbledore, you would join myself and Karkaroff for a drink. Maxime asked Dumbledore. Harry definitely noted an air of triumph to her. For some reason, her giddy tone infuriated him as much as the thought of him being ruled unfit. Naturally, I'd be delighted, Dumbledore answered. Karkaroff grinned towards Dumbledore in a most disturbing fashion. He too looked particularly pleased with himself. Harry, I suggest you go up to bed, said Dumbledore, smiling at him. I am sure Gryffindor are waiting to celebrate with you, and it would be a shame to deprive them of this excellent excuse to make a great deal of mess and noise. Harry glanced at Fleur, who cast him a sideways glance and a crooked smile before exiting the room in front of him. He made to follow her out the door. Potter, if you will, a word. Harry turned to see McGonagall hanging back as the rest of the group had left. He sighed deeply and closed the door as the last of the rest of the group exited. Just how stupid are you, boy? McGonagall's tone was not conversational like Dumbledore's had been. Her words cut through him like razor wire. I didn't mean to. Harry collected himself for a second and tried again. Professor, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for things to get this far. It was meant to be nothing. I was talking with the French girl, the champion, and I guess she dared me, or I told her I would enter to impress her or something, but when I said it, I figured she would just forget about it. And then I couldn't sleep, so I got up really early before breakfast and just, threw my name at it, and it went in because why wouldn't it? Not that she bears any guilt in this. He was rambling again. But it was just, I let myself get carried away, and now this whole thing, and I'm really sorry. It's always you, isn't it, Mr. Potter? Harry hung his head. He had absolutely nothing to reply to this. McGonagall poked him in the chest, and he looked up. Her expression was still stern. The other two headmasters think you have no business in this tournament. An easy win for their champions. A stupid boy who's gotten himself in over his head. Her tone softened some as she continued. Potter, please prove them wrong. You absolute idiot. You prove them wrong, or I'll have you in detention for the rest of your academic career here. For your own good. Harry looked up from the floor. McGonagall didn't look angry anymore. He merely nodded weakly. The great hall was empty now. The room was dark and quiet. The candles had burned out, and the pumpkins floating high in the enchanted ceiling were mostly dark orbs, save for a few who still had a weak flickering candle inside them, casting off small spots of light. Close to the door leading to the great hall, a slender figure with long silvery hair stood leaning against the wall. Her arms were crossed, and though he could not see her face in the dim light, he knew immediately that it was Fleur. Harry Potter, it seems you are my rival now, said Fleur with a smile. Of your own making, Harry replied glumly. Right now, Harry had no witty remarks. He scanned over the pretty French girl, ransacking himself as to just how badly he screwed up. You are not happy to be chosen? You as the chance to compete for the honor. 10,000 galleons. If anything, I should be angry with you. You tricked me, burst out Fleur. Your headmistress Maxime didn't seem to be bothered. Fleur huffed. They reached the entrance hall. It had a more subdued ambience now that the goblet was gone. Well, I'm this way, Harry said before slowly starting to climb the marble steps. You are not walking me to my carriage, said Fleur. Harry turned around. Fleur stood with her arms crossed at the bottom of the stairs, with a look of expectation. She whipped her silver hair back haughtily. See you around, Fleur, said Harry, turning back to continue his slow trek up the many stairs. He could hear the French Villa girl huffing angrily behind him and stomp out of the entrance hall. Harry couldn't really believe how much he had messed things up for himself. He knew what Hermione would say, that it was his own stupid fault. He hoped that Ron still thought it was a great stunt at least, and wouldn't join Hermione in admonishing him. He could really use Ron right now. He knew most of his house would be pretty excited that he had managed to enter the tournament. Even though he was facing competitors 3 years his senior in tasks that had been deemed by the Ministry too dangerous to attempt for anyone not of age. Though admittedly he had faced dangers before, though if he was being honest with himself, if a panel of judges had been scoring any of those, he can't imagine particularly high scores would have been doled out for any one of those things. Mostly he had wound up in the hospital wing badly injured, and more often than not received outside help anyway, something that was strictly forbidden in the Triwizard tournament. When Harry entered the portrait of the fat lady, Harry was met with a blast of noise that almost knocked him flat on his backside. Dumbledore's shenanigans. Albus Dumbledore sat in his high-backed chair, the golden light of the candles flickering around the circular office. The quiet hum of magic seemed to thrum in the very walls of the room, but tonight it felt more restless, unsettled. His desk was cluttered with papers and half-read reports, yet his focus was elsewhere, his gaze fixed on the ancient goblet of fire resting atop a pedestal in the corner. It still faintly glowed, embers of its blue flames flickering out from time to time, the last dying signs of life from the magical artifact until the next time it would be needed. The portraits of former headmasters and headmistresses hung in their ornate frames around the walls of the office. Most of them were awake now, having been roused from their sleep by the headmaster's arrival. Some were muttering amongst themselves, others watching Dumbledore with quiet expectancy. Phineas Nigellus Black, among them, was staring down at him with a sardonic twist to his lips. "Curious business tonight, isn't it?" Phineas drawled, leaning forward in his frame. 3 champions as expected, and yet young Potter managed to get the goblet twice to produce his twice. Twice, that is unheard of. I don't suppose you believe that was an accident. Dumbledore folded his hands, his eyes twinkling with the kind of weariness that rarely showed through his usual calm demeanor. He leaned back slightly in his chair and took a deep breath before replying. "No, Phineas. It was no accident," he said softly, his eyes narrowing in contemplation. Harry putting his name in once was unexpected. Youthful curiosity, perhaps, a lapse in judgment. However, his name appearing twice, under 2 separate entries. His voice trailed off as he looked up at the smirking figure in the portrait. A ripple of murmurs swept through the other portraits. Dilys Derwent, a former headmistress with a stern but kind face, looked down at Dumbledore with concern. "You must have an idea who could have done it, Albus. The boy is neither powerful enough nor cunning enough. This is too advanced for someone his age, surely." Dumbledore's fingers drummed lightly against his desk. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but deliberate. "Cunning I wouldn't be so certain the boy lacks. But that is not where my concern lies. The magic that surrounds the goblet is ancient and binding. Whoever entered Harry's name the second time did so without specifying a school, violating the rules of the tournament. Normally, that should have caused the goblet to reject the entry entirely. But for it to accept such a submission means 2 things. First, it means that whoever entered it has studied magical contracts law very extensively. Secondly, that person is capable of a supremely powerful confundus charm." Phineas gave a low chuckle, as if enjoying the drama unfolding before him. "But you said it yourself, Dumbledore. The goblet forms a magical contract. Whoever placed that second entry in Potter's name has bound him to compete whether the goblet realized its deception or not. So what happens when the rules are broken in such a way? Regress." Dumbledore's face darkened slightly, his thoughts spinning. "That is what concerns me, Phineas. It is bound by both rules and intent. Harry's second entry suggests, given that he is already bound to compete, means that whoever submitted his name may find themselves entangled in the contract's consequences. The person is the intermediary, and the plights of the contracts fall back on him by recidivity. The goblet requires the school's banner to champion its victor. Without one, he let the sentence hang, the implication weighing heavily in the air." Everard, another portrait with sharp eyes, spoke from his frame beside Phineas. "If you're right, Albus, whoever entered Harry's name may suffer." "Yes," gravely, Dumbledore said quietly, his gaze returning to the goblet's flickering flame. "The second submission was an act of cunning. Someone wanted Harry in this tournament, but not under the protection of a school. By doing so, they have left themselves as well." The portraits exchanged uneasy glances, the gravity of Dumbledore's words sinking in. The goblet of fire was not to be trifled with. Whoever had tampered with it would not escape the consequences lightly. "Then what do you intend to do?" Dilys asked, her voice filled with concern. "You cannot simply leave it as it is. The boy's life is at risk." Dumbledore stood slowly, his tall figure casting long shadows across the room. His mind was racing through possibilities, weighing each action carefully. The boy's life is not at risk. He will compete, and the moment he enters the first task, his end is fulfilled. The second note, however, I think myself to have a good notion of what is going on, but there is much to do, he said gravely, before the goblet dispatches him or her. Phineas's eyes gleamed with interest. Ah, yes, I know that. Look, you're planning to sneak about, aren't you? Dumbledore's lips twitched into a small smile. I believe, Phineas, that I will need a little help from Dip-Pet. He turned to the large painting of Armando Dip-Pet, who had been pretending to be asleep throughout the conversation, but now peeked one eye open curiously. Armando, I trust you don't mind if I use your route to the dungeons? Dip-Pet grumbled something incoherent, but waved his hand dismissively, signaling his approval. Dumbledore stepped toward the painting. The space in the portrait behind the old headmaster shimmered, as if the canvas was liquid. I'll be gone for only a short time, Dumbledore said to the room at large, though his words were mostly for the benefit of the more cautious portraits. Without another word, Dumbledore stepped into the passageway. After what seemed like only a moment, Dumbledore emerged from a shadowed alcove on the other side of the castle, hidden just outside a familiar office door. He straightened his robes, his blue eyes dark with purpose, and looked up at the brass nameplate, Alastair Moody. Dumbledore paused, listening intently for any sound from within. The office was silent, too silent. His hand hovered over the door for a moment before he pulled back, choosing not to knock. Instead, he folded his arms into his sleeves, standing there in the quiet, the faint hum of the castle around him. Double data. Author's note. Ideally, there would be something between this and the previous, but again, editor likely needed. Make it a sport in finding flaws/holes in the story. The defense against the dark arts classroom buzzed with low chatter as Harry, Ron, and Hermione slipped into their usual seats. Tension hung in the air, more palpable now with the first task of the Triwizard tournament looming just days away. Harry could feel the weight of the upcoming challenge pressing down on him, though he was doing his best to ignore it. Everyone seemed to be talking about what kind of terrifying creatures or deadly traps the champions might face. And Harry, despite all the attention and praise, wasn't entirely sure he was ready. The door creaked open, and the room fell silent as Moody limped inside. His wooden leg struck the stone floor with a rhythmic clunk, his magical eye swiveling wildly around the classroom, scanning the students with unnerving precision. His normal eye fixed on Harry for a moment before moving on, the corner of his scarred mouth pulling into a slight grimace. Right, Moody growled as he reached the front of the room, thumping his staff on the floor for emphasis. Today, we're continuing with curses. I've shown you the unforgivable curses, but those are far from the only dangerous magic you'll encounter out there, especially with what's coming. Harry swallowed. The reminder of the first task made his stomach twist. Now, Moody continued, his voice harsh and gravelly, there's a curse you ought to know about. The Intral-Expelling Curse. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. One of the darkest bits of magic you'll find outside the unforgivable lot. Picture a summoning charm, only instead of summoning objects, it pulls your insides right out of you. Used by dark wizards during the old wars. Lethal and painful. There was a ripple of uneasy murmurs across the room. Harry caught a glimpse of Seamus Finnegan turning pale in the corner of his eye. Why are we learning about this? Seamus muttered, though it was clear Moody heard him. Moody's magical eye swiveled to focus on Seamus, his normal one narrowing dangerously. Why? He repeated, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. Because you need to be prepared. When you're out there, whether it's fighting Death Eaters or, say, facing a dragon in a tournament, you won't get a warning about the kinds of curses coming your way. And trust me, Finnegan, you don't want to be caught off guard. Harry tensed at the mention of dragons. Moody's eye flickered back to him for a moment, as if he knew exactly what was running through Harry's mind. The tournament. The first task. Could it really be dragons? Moody continued his lecture, detailing the intricacies of the entrail, expelling curse, how to recognize it, and what to do if you ever found yourself facing it. But Harry found it hard to focus. His thoughts kept drifting back to the looming task, to the uncertainty of what he would have to face. The idea of standing in front of a dragon or any deadly creature made his stomach churn. As the class wore on, the murmurs about the upcoming task grew louder, students exchanging nervous glances. Moody, ever watchful, seemed to ignore it, though Harry could sense the tension building in the room. Finally, the bell rang, and the students began packing up their things. "Potter," Moody's gruff voice called out, just as Harry was about to leave with Ron and Hermione. "Stay behind for a moment." Harry exchanged a quick, puzzled glance with his friends. Ron gave him a half shrug, and Hermione looked slightly concerned. They hesitated by the door, but Harry waved them off. "I'll catch up with you in a bit," he muttered. When the last student left, Moody limped over to his desk, his magical eye still whizzing around as though checking for any eavesdroppers. He gestured for Harry to approach. "You're handling yourself well, Potter," Moody said, his voice low, almost approving. "Better than I expected, given the circumstances." "Thanks," Harry muttered, unsure where this was going. He still wasn't used to receiving praise, especially not for something like this. "But, why do you want to talk to me?" Moody's scarred face twisted into what might have been a smile, though it looked more like a grimace. "I'm offering you a bit of extra help," he said, his tone conspiratorial. "Extra credit, you could say." Harry blinked, surprised. "Extra credit?" Moody nodded, leaning in slightly. "I've seen how you handle yourself. Resourceful, quick on your feet, but the first task gets no joke. You'll need every advantage you can get." Harry's mind raced. Extra credit? If it meant learning something that could help him survive the first task, he wasn't about to say no. What kind of extra credit? Moody's magical eye swiveled again, checking the room one last time before he spoke. "A few private lessons, extra defense work, something a bit more hands-on than what we've been doing in class. But you'll need to keep this between us. Favoritism, see?" He gave a low chuckle. "Can't have anyone thinking I'm giving you special treatment." Harry hesitated for a second, the idea of secret lessons stirring a mix of excitement and unease. But if it helped him prepare for the first task, if it gave him even a slight edge, it was worth it. "All right," Harry agreed. "When do we start?" "Meet me in the dungeons," Moody instructed, his voice low and steady. "After curfew tonight. We'll keep it quiet." Harry's heart pounded in his chest, a mix of nerves and anticipation filling him. "Got it. I won't tell anyone." Moody gave a satisfied nod. "Good lad. And Potter, be prepared. You'll need it." With that, Moody dismissed him, turning back to his desk as if nothing had happened. Harry hurried out of the classroom, his mind buzzing with the idea of what these extra lessons could mean. If Moody was offering him this kind of help, it had to be important. As he made his way through the corridors, heading toward the dungeons after curfew, Harry felt the weight of the tournament pressing down on him more than ever. The first task was coming, and now, with Moody's extra help, he might just have a chance. Later that evening, under the invisibility cloak, Harry walked along the dungeon corridors. The note had said the second door on the left, then third on the right, and into the hallway through the door. It must have been a 10-minute walk from the Great Hall by the time he arrived. His hands trembled slightly with nerve. To be taught by the greatest Auror alive was a great honor. Harry only hoped he wouldn't disappoint him. Walking through the last door according to the instructions, a very thick iron door, he saw a narrow corridor with a low stone ceiling and a dirty flagstone floor. The door pulled shut behind him, the handle wrenching from his grip by its own. Harry arrived in the cramped corridor a minute early, trembling slightly, unsure of what was to come. Moody stood in the middle of the corridor, giving a very menacing impression as the torches cast long shadows in his deeply scarred facial features. "Potter," he growled, "we begin immediately. Fight me." Harry opened his mouth, surprised. The mood was very intense. He felt his heart rate quicken even further. He tentatively drew his wand, hesitation very apparent in his movements. Moody gave an impatient growl and whipped the air with his wand. Harry flew backwards into the heavy door and fell to the ground, the air in his lungs knocked out of him. "Do you think me some schoolgirl waiting for you to ask her to prom? We fight." Moody whipped his wand savagely in the air. A bang echoed in the low-ceilinged corridor, and then darkness enveloped his senses completely. He opened his eyes wide, as if that would somehow let a small amount of light into them. But the darkness was so thick it felt like he was submersed in tar. A faint panting echoed quietly against the stone walls. He could sense before his inner eye excitement building in the shallow, breathing pattern. A silhouette of Moody slowly materialized before his eyes. The door had locked all light out when it shut, and Harry's eyes were widened to try and force any light in. He studied the silhouette that was projected before his mind's eye. Weary of making any sound, he decided to trust himself. His voice rang in the corridor. Expelliarmus, the room that had been dead quiet, now illuminated by a flash of red and a loud bang. The scarred teacher shone in the brief light, exactly as Harry had pictured him, though little help it was, for the victory was short-lived. Another flash indicated that the spell had been easily deflected by the far more experienced and skilled Auror. Harry tried to stay moving now. The duel had begun. Still completely blind, he sidestepped quickly, idly remembering the overheard conversation Moody had after one of his defense against the dark arts classes. His magical "I doesn't need light to see." The sound of Moody's breathing reached a crescendo. Harry could tell his excitement was building with every moment. And then, without warning, Crucio, a quick flash that lit up the expression of twisted joy over the scarred features of his defense against the dark arts teacher's face in a narrow dungeon corridor. The mirror image of the flash burned on his retinas as pain shot through him like nothing he had ever felt before. It was an electrifying sensation that enveloped him fully. He screamed for as long as he could, but after a while his body simply surrendered to the pain. The pain was so total, it blocked out all thoughts. He couldn't move, he couldn't scream. And as sudden as it struck him, it was over. He lay still on the cold stone floor, unsure if he was alive, struggling to draw shallow breaths. "Get up! This is a fight, and you are not dead, Potter. Get up!" Harry did not stir. "Get up, Potter, or are you trying to imitate dear mother?" Crucio. The taunt stirred Harry to action. He moved before the curse was pronounced, and it hit where Harry had laid a moment earlier. In the brief flash of light, Harry tried to memorize the position of Moody and the walls. But he only ran a few steps before another spell hit him square in the chest. It knocked the wind out of him, and he collapsed against the wall. "You think this is how you survive against a Death Eater, Potter? You think this is how your father fought the Dark Lord?" Crucio. A flash of Moody standing above him. Harry took the spell with resignation, hunched over against the dungeon wall. The pain cleared his mind again of all thought. His world was nothing but pain. He did not know for how long it lasted, but when it ended, he faintly noticed he was still upright, albeit on a knee. Harry flailed his arm out for where Moody had held his wand earlier, hoping to knock it out of his hand, but his arm met only air. Pathetic. Crucio. Harry collapsed to the floor. This repeated over and over again. Harry had no recollection of time. All he knew was that he at some point found himself in a lit corridor and his teacher gone. He was lying in a puddle. At some point during the torture spells, he must have soiled himself. He had no recollection of this. Slowly, with trembling hands, he got himself on his feet and pulled out his wand to clean himself off. The road back to Gryffindor Tower had exhausted what little energy Harry had left. He tried to return the greetings offered by his fellow Gryffindors as he entered the common room, but even that small effort drained him. Every smile he forced felt heavier than the last, and by the time he cut through the chattering crowd, he barely had the strength to reach his bed. Harry was somewhat grateful that Ron and Hermione were too swept up in what was likely Ron's homework to notice him. He had neither the energy nor the will to explain why he looked and felt as utterly exhausted as he did. But despite his weariness, sleep offered no respite. Every time he closed his eyes, flashes of cruel, violent laughter jolted him awake, again and again, like a shadow lurking in the corners of his mind. Each time, the sensation of something dark looming over him became stronger, and his heart raced with the residual fear of the unknown. By morning, Harry felt utterly destroyed. Pulling himself out of bed took all the willpower he could muster. His body ached, and his eyes stung with the exhaustion of restless sleep. As he stumbled toward his trunk, Ron glanced over his brow furrowed with concern. "What happened to you, mate?" Ron asked, eyeing Harry with a mixture of worry and disbelief. "Didn't get much sleep," Harry muttered, trying to shake the fogginess from his head. Ron raised an eyebrow. "What about the bruises?" Harry blinked, looking down at his arms and chest. His skin was mottled with dark purple and blue bruises, as though he'd been in a rough Quidditch match but there hadn't been one. He vaguely remembered falling out of bed in the middle of the night, jolted awake by another nightmare. But he hadn't realized just how badly he'd battered himself. "Oh, must have been Quidditch or something," Harry said, rubbing his arm and wincing at the soreness. "I don't know. You didn't have Quidditch last night, mate," Ron pointed out, his worried expression deepening. "Yeah, I meant practice for the tournament," Harry corrected quickly, hoping Ron wouldn't push further. Ron's frown remained, but he nodded, albeit unconvinced. "All right, sure you're all right, though?" "Yeah," Harry lied, avoiding Ron's gaze. "I'll be fine." The rest of the morning passed in a blur, with Harry trying and failing to focus in his classes. His mind was clouded with the echoes of sleepless nights and the strange, recurring nightmares that haunted him. He found himself replaying the visions over and over, trying to make sense of the disjointed images that had shaken him so deeply. The violent laughter, the pitch-dark dungeon. Over the next few days, Harry found rest elusive. The bruises faded slowly, but his energy seemed to be sapped. A sense of unease around Moody just wouldn't subside, and Harry found himself wondering if he should ask for another one, if he wasn't about that life. For now, he decided he wasn't up for more. Whenever Ron or Hermione pressed him about his extra credit lesson and his bruises, Harry deflected, offering vague explanations about the stress of the Triwizard tournament. Hermione was suspicious, but even she seemed to let it slide, knowing how much was on Harry's plate with the first task approaching. Horntails, author's note, got nothing. Enjoy, you animals. By the time the morning of the first task arrived, Harry felt the familiar knot of anxiety twisting in his stomach. He stood at the mirror in the dormitory, staring at his pale reflection. His face looked thinner, the circles under his eyes darker than they had been just days before. "You ready?" Ron asked as he entered the room, his voice breaking the silence. He looked nervous, though he was doing his best to hide it. Harry forced a smile. "As ready as I'll ever be." They left the dormitory together, meeting Hermione in the common room. She gave Harry a quick once-over, clearly still concerned, but said nothing. The three of them made their way down the staircases, heading toward the Great Hall for breakfast. As they approached the doors, Harry's heart began to pound in his chest. Today was the day. The first task. Whatever was waiting for him out there, he would have to face it. He tried to focus on the noise of the castle waking up around them, on the bustling students making their way to the Great Hall, but the shadow of uncertainty loomed large in his mind. With a deep breath, Harry stepped toward the entrance, the weight of the day settling heavily on his shoulders. The day of the task, the lessons were scheduled to end at midday, in order to give all the students time to get down to where the first task was supposed to take place. The unrest at not knowing what the first task entailed had somewhat dissipated in Harry, though every now and then a jolt of panic would shoot through him, as his imagination would run wild in the back of his mind. The worst his mind had conjured thus far had been to be led in front of one of Aragog's spawn. Fighting a spider the size of a car definitely seemed on brand for a Triwizard tournament. The mere thought had kept him sleepless most of the night before. At breakfast, Harry was firmly stuck in a haze of nerves and bad premonitions. "It's strange," Hermione began. "Yeah," Ron agreed, distracted by some other part of the Great Hall, likely the French delegation at the Ravenclaw table. Hermione gave him an annoyed sideways glance before continuing. "It's strange. There was a fourth note that came out of the cup after you left. Dumbledore took it, but didn't read aloud what it said." Harry shrugged over his bowl of cereal. This could impossibly help him overcome the first task. He shrugged morosely. "So what?" "So, the goblet only produces names of champions. There are only 3 of you, but there is a 4th that remained unannounced." Harry glanced at the Ravenclaw table where Fleur Delacour gracefully ate breakfast surrounded by a court of students. She showed no signs of nervousness. He looked over at the Slytherin table, where Crumb sat equally unfazed. Harry caught Crumb's eyes for a moment, Crumb frowned at him, before Harry again continued to stare down at his uneaten toast. That can't be right. I'm 14, and it's not like I wasn't allowed to be chosen. Who can be less eligible than me? Colin Creevey, Ron said helpfully. Hermione shot him a stern glare. What about Goyle? He would be terrible, Ron said with a laugh. Harry found himself smiling despite himself. He would be terrible. Hermione continued. All I'm saying is that there might be a fourth champion, so just be prepared for that eventuality. What? A secret champion? Who would that be? Mad-Eye. Harry felt oddly isolated, even walking through the crowds, wishing him good luck. He walked in a daze through the throngs of students stopping around him. He was making his way to lunch when Professor McGonagall hurried over to him in the Great Hall. Potter, the champions are to gather on the grounds. You have to get ready for the first task. Relieved in truth that he would miss lunch, for risk of just puking it all out momentarily, he simply turned in the door to the Great Hall, but only after catching Ron's eye and giving him a silent nod, which was returned by a white-faced Ron. He walked out of the entrance hall with Professor McGonagall. She struck him as more anxious even than he himself felt. She put her hand on his shoulder. Her movements were twitchy, her face gray. Whatever you do, don't panic, she said. Just don't panic. There are wizards on the sidelines ready to step in if anything would go amiss. Just do your best and nobody will think any less of you. Thank you, Professor, Harry said mechanically. Harry was being led towards the forest, and as they turned a corner, he saw that there was a large tent he was being led into. This is you, along with the other champions, said Professor McGonagall. Her voice was shaky. You wait your turn, Potter, and Bagman will be. Good luck. Harry went inside. Fleur was sitting in a corner. She looked unfazed, as collected and perfect as any day. This somehow made Harry even more nervous. Victor Crumb looked even more so. He looked focused but ready. This must be nothing to an international Quidditch star. Harry wished he looked on the outside as collected as the other two champions. Harry. Perfect, said Bagman happily. Come on in. Make yourself at home. Bagman looked giddy with excitement. He was wearing his old Quidditch robes, no doubt to honor the occasion. He looked like a giant fat hornet. Well, we're all there. The task then, said Bagman, beaming at all of them in turn. When the audience has assembled, I'm going to be offering each of you this bag. He held up a small silken bag, from which you will each select a small model of whatever you are about to face. There are different varieties, you see, and I have to tell you something else too. Your task is to collect the golden egg. Harry looked around at the other two champions. They still looked cool, calm, and collected. Perhaps they thought this was going to be nothing, just slay some beast and a party afterwards. Harry swallowed down a bout of nausea, grateful he didn't have lunch. Around them, footsteps could be heard, hundreds of them, as the audience gathered for the show. Harry found himself in one corner of the tent, his thoughts running a million miles an hour, when a squeaky voice shook him from his reverie. Ron's younger sister, Ginny, was gesturing for Harry from outside the opening of the tent. She looked pale and tiny, but her expression was urgent. Harry walked out of the tent and over to her. Here, Harry. You got this, Ginny whispered to Harry. She thrust a jumble of rolled-up, moth-eaten cloth into his hands. Ginny, what dash, Harry began, but Ginny cut over him. Just shut up. Hagrid told me. You've taken on worse than this, so just take this and do what you do. She got on her toes and kissed him on the cheek before she turned and ran away from the tent to join the crowd heading towards where the task was supposed to take place. He looked down at what had been thrust into his hands and realized he was holding the sorting hat. How had she come about the sorting hat? Hagrid told her what? Harry, here if you will. Bagman's voice called him back into the tent. Harry stuffed the hat into a pocket of his robes and walked back into the tent. For some reason, seeing Ginny and being reminded of the events 2 years prior steeled him, but only somewhat. Harry didn't hear a word coming out of Bagman's mouth, but he saw that Fleur put a hand into the bag offered up by Bagman, only to withdraw a tiny, poison green, winged lizard. A dragon. The first task was dragons. What about dragons? Slay them? Crumb pulled out another miniature dragon. This one was bright red and had a longer body, almost like a winged snake. He noticed that the miniatures had a collar with an attached number. Crumbs read the number 2. Bagman held the bag up to Harry now, and he pulled a miniature of a black dragon with a long, spiky tail. His miniature was markedly larger than the other two, about twice as large as theirs. It had the number 3 around its neck. The little dragon hissed at Harry as he studied it in his hand. Harry studied the small, angry creature in his hand. He was somewhat aware that Bagman was talking to the group again. Harry found himself pulled out of the tent again, by Bagman this time. Harry realized he hadn't heard a single word of the instructions. "You good, Harry?" "What?" said Harry. "Are you fine?" "Got a plan?" said Bagman, in a low, conspiratorial voice. "I wouldn't mind sharing a few pointers. I mean, anything you need? Kill the dragon? Get the egg, right?" "Should be fine," said Harry with a nervous laugh. Bagman blinked, thrown by what Harry had just said. "No, Harry, I just told you dash." A whistle had blown somewhere, and Bagman reluctantly cut himself off mid-sentence. He turned around with an exasperated expression. "Just you don't have tea." A distant voice shouted angrily, "Bagman, for heaven's sake." He turned away from Harry and hurried off. Not even Bagman believed he could slay the dragon, the only adult wizard in this school who had seemed to genuinely root for him. Finally, even Bagman had realized just how hopelessly out of his depths Harry actually was. The look on Bagman's face when Harry told him what he had to do. He probably didn't even think Harry should walk out of the tent. He felt very alone in this realization. At least Ginny believed in him. Harry walked back to the tent only to see Fleur exiting the tent in an opening facing towards where he had heard the crowds gather previously. He and Crumb waited in silence as the roars of the crowd indicated that Fleur had begun facing her dragon. Harry didn't hear much of what was said, though he recognized Bagman's voice commentating. He toyed with the rolled-up piece of cloth stuffed inside his robes with his fingers as he paced the tent. He knew what he would do. He suppressed a desperate urge to vomit. At some point, Crumb was called out of the tent by the blow of a whistle, leaving Harry alone. Harry paced the tent for an unknown time, until another blow of a whistle indicated to him that it was his turn next. Harry walked through the entrance of the tent, oddly calm. He walked through a gap in a fence that no doubt encircled the enclosure in which the first task would take place. He saw everything around him as if separated from his body. Several hundred spectators lined a sort of natural arena. It was a vast space in the middle of probably 300 feet across. The ground was blackened, with only a few lonesome shrubberies unburnt where the dragons of the previous tasks had been fought. In the middle of the blackened no-man's land stood a giant, pitch-black, winged lizard Harry knew to be the dragon he was faced with. It was hard to judge size from hundreds of yards away, but it must have easily stood at least 40 feet tall. The dragon had her evil, yellow eyes upon him the second he exited the tent. Vaguely, Harry was aware that Bagman's voice was shouting excitedly somewhere in the distance. Harry exhaled a shaky breath and began slowly walking towards the dragon. Air seemed to struggle to enter his lungs. His hand fingered the ball of cloth in his robes idly, probing the opening in the hat. The giant black lizard was fettered to the ground by an enormous iron chain. It rattled loudly as the scaly monster thrashed violently. Upon seeing its adversary, the dragon let out a roar that physically shook Harry's chest and shot a burst of flames towards him that easily covered 2/3 of the way to him. His vision of the dragon was obscured completely by hot, bright flames. For a moment, all he could see of the enclosure was an inferno of fire. But as quickly as the violent flames had appeared, they rose and turned into heavy black smoke that clung to the air. Hot air washed over him, the last remains of the dragon's breath of flames. Harry's nostrils filled with the suffocating smell of sulfur. It stung the back of his throat. He suppressed the urge to cough violently. Harry tried to inhale a calming breath, though it felt like all the fresh air that only moments ago had surrounded him had been consumed by the dragon fire. His throat constricted from the smoke, and his eyes watered. Another burst of flame shot out towards him. This time the flames got so close to him, he actually had to turn away, because the radiating heat on his face was unbearable. As the heat struck him again, he felt his fingers find metal inside his robes. His fingers gripped closely what he knew to be a ruby-encrusted hilt that had appeared in the opening of the bundle of cloth. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he told himself he would buy Ginny Weasley the most extravagant Christmas present she's ever had, seen, or imagined. From his robes, he produced the sword and held it along his side. A calm came over him. He walked slowly towards the raging dragon. Through his tunnel vision, he felt the audience draw a collective breath. He heard Bagman's tone shift from excited to uncertain. The Hogwarts champion has elected to fence the dragon. It seems this was a terrible plan. As Harry made his way forward, the yellow eyes of the black dragon followed him closely. She hunched lower over her clutch of eggs and let out another burst of flames toward him. This time, Harry was close enough to where he thought the flames might actually reach him and quickly sidestepped the enormous fireball. The dragon had aimed its outburst straight towards Harry, and its field of flames was wide, way wider than he should have been able to sidestep, but looked sideways to see the flames shoot past him, until the heat from the inferno struck him full force and forced him to turn away. The heat seemed less severe this time, though. Again, the flames disappeared as quickly as they had appeared, and the dragon scanned the field quickly to find its quarry. Its neck caused the large chain to snap violently as it again trained its head towards him. Another furious barrage of flames shot towards him. Harry found himself collapsing sideways this time to avoid the violent flames. Heat poured over his body from above, and he sought refuge in the cold mud. He dug his face and hands into the mud as deep as he could. The heat above him was unbearable. But again, as soon as it started, the flames subsided, and he poked his head up to take stock of the situation. The dragon's head was sweeping from side to side, evidently looking for him. The chain rattled with every single movement. The grounds around him were smoking. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he was vaguely aware of the noise of the crowd, but he had only eyes for the beast in front of him. The dragon's head swerved violently, turning away from Harry. Harry launched himself upright and ran for it. The beast was turned completely away from him, and he managed to close about a third of the distance towards it before it let out an ear-splitting roar. He froze instinctually and entered a low posture, ready to drop to the ground again. It turned out to be a wise decision. For the next moment, the dragon lowered its head and let out a violent burst of flame as it turned around simultaneously. Had he been running, there is no way he would have had time to drop to the ground quick enough to dodge the wide sweep of hellfire that occupied the very space he had just evacuated. Again, he found himself pushing himself as deep as he could into the freezing November mud. He felt the hilt of the sword heat in his hand, like a cast iron pan left on the stove, but he only gripped it tighter. Again, as soon as it had begun, the heat was gone. He peeked up from the mud and saw only a mass of black spikes moving towards him. The head was still sweeping back and forth looking for him, but it had only to glance slightly downward to find him lying there, an easy target. Harry steeled himself, gripped the burning hilt harder in his hand, and raised himself up. The stadium was dead quiet, save for the violent clanks from the chain fettering the dragon. If he could only close the distance, maybe 60 feet at most, then maybe he stood a chance here. And then maybe he could bury this sword in the skull of this dragon, just like he had done to the basilisk. He leaned into a sprint towards the enormous beast as he idly wondered if a dragon also had venomous teeth. As he sprinted harder than he had in all his life, he mused that being bitten by teeth several feet long, any potential venom would make very little difference. He had closed the distance quicker than he could have hoped for and raised the sword to strike. The dragon whipped down as it noticed its tiny Fomir feet from it. It snapped its massive head towards him, jaws open and baring sharp yellow teeth the size of table legs. Harry gripped the sword with both his hands, readying himself for what was now inevitable. The dragon would snap at him, attempting to tear his body to pieces. It was as if time slowed down. He studied the evil eyes of the great dragon. They were fixed on him, a deadpan gaze. It reared, readying for the charge that was coming now any second. From the corner of his eye, a great black studded tail was crashing towards him, and he again dropped to the ground. The tail passed over his head, and before the dragon had fixed its evil eyes on him again, he was back on his feet, sword held ready. The head crashed forward, jaws open wide. Harry had been awaiting it, still experiencing the moment, as if artificially slowed down. He stepped out of the immediate path of the giant jaws and swiped at the head as it passed. The blade buried itself deep in the neck of the great beast, and the effect was immediate. The blade was not long enough to slice through the full thickness of the beast's neck, but it slid through the flesh that it found as if it weren't there. A gash large enough to fit Harry several times appeared in the scaly side of the black neck. Blood sprayed from the wound with such velocity that it pelted him painfully with droplets the size of apples that pounded him. He slashed a second time, and a third, a fourth, and over, until the head separated from the massive body completely. The body of the dragon rolled over, pulling the neck away from the body, revealing a dark hole that leaked bright red blood in such quantities that it would surely fill bathtubs with every pulse. Steam was rising in the cold air from the enormous pools of scarlet blood that covered everything around him. Adrenaline washed over him in waves as he stood next to the slain monster, catching his breath slowly. It was like a radio had tuned in the world around him again, as he heard distantly the announcement of Bagman yelling. Though he could not tune in to what he was actually saying, the pounding of the adrenaline in his ears was still too great. Another violent urge to vomit was fought down with some difficulties. The strong smell of wet blood did not help in suppressing the urge to throw up. Harry saw the dragon keepers walking towards him, though in no particular hurry. They all wore expressions of shock on their faces. Harry passed them and caught one of them saying something to the other, who hummed in stunned agreement. At the entrance to the enclosure, McGonagall and Professor Moody was waving him to them. He started walking over to them before catching himself, turning back to the nest of eggs, and heaving the golden one up and walked over to his professors on shaky legs. You. Professor McGonagall struggled. That was excellent, boy. Moody grunted, excellent. McGonagall nodded a white face in agreement. She pointed him towards a second tent with a red cross on it. You'll need to see Madame Pomfrey, Potter. McGonagall's voice was shaky. Harry let himself be led into the second tent, where Madame Pomfrey stood waiting. Her white garb was covered in blood and soot, rather like she herself had fought a dragon, Harry thought. When she saw him, she let out a shrill scream. Harry looked at himself and realized he was completely bathed in dragon blood. It's not mine. She stared at him for a moment, waving her wand over him. Dragons, she said. At least it's you and not that beast this time. Pomfrey muttered angrily. She pulled Harry toward seclusion. The tent was divided into several such cubicles, in one of which he glanced a body lying on a bed covered head to foot in bandages. Several of them were dark red. Who is that? Harry said, as Pomfrey was sitting him down and tearing his robes off him. The Durmstrang boy. Dragon fire. Stupid contest. Pomfrey muttered angrily. Healers from Mungo's will be here momentarily to pick him up. Can you let go of this stupid sword, please, so I can tend to your hand? Pomfrey said angrily, but Harry found that he couldn't. He looked down towards his hand and saw that it was horribly burnt. He tried again to let go of the hilt, but his fingers were fused to the sword. Okay then, this is going to be very painful, said Pomfrey before waving her wand and severing his hand from the hilt, along with a sizable portion of the skin of his palm. To his amazement, Harry felt nothing. That pain you aren't feeling, said Pomfrey sardonically, is either adrenaline or you've got full thickness burns to your hand. And if that is the case, you aren't using your hand for the rest of the week. Let me tell you that, boy. Oh, and the blood you are absolutely drenched in, you're going to have to scrub that yourself. Can't scourgify something that magically potent. I wouldn't sleep on that either, boy. Dragon's blood has a ton of magical properties, some of them good, but we don't know too much about the effects of subcutaneous diffusion from dragon's blood. Her tone was dry as paper. Got it, blood may be bad. Have a bath at earliest convenience. Harry responded idly. Madame Pomfrey proceeded to slather up most of his back, the back of both his hands, and some of his left shoulder with a strongly smelling purple ointment. She ordered him to sit at least a few minutes before she returned to see to the mummified Victor Crumb. Even though he had been ordered by Madame Pomfrey to sit for a few minutes before leaving the tent, Harry found himself far too wound up to merely sit on a hospital bed at the moment. Before he reached the exit of the tent, however, he was intercepted by two people, Hermione and Ron. "Harry, that was bloody incredible," Ron said in an awestruck voice. "Absolutely no contest, the best one by far." But Harry looked at Ron with a doubtful expression, not entirely believing the praise to be truthful. "Harry, mate, you were the only champion to actually finish the task. Crumb was burnt to a crisp and had to be carried off, and that French chick ate a fireball too, though she at least managed to abort the task herself." Harry glanced over to Hermione, who had been oddly quiet. There were fingernail marks across her face where she had been clutching it in fear. "You were amazing, Harry," she said in a squeaky voice. "I'm sorry for being so harsh on you. I should have dropped it." Harry shrugged his shoulders. "It's fine, it was stupid of me to enter. I've got no business competing against these people," said Harry with a small smile. Hermione flung herself around his shoulders in a bone-crushing hug. He could feel the burns on his backside, seared dully under her arms. When she released him, she was covered in black grime and blood. Harry apologized for covering her in filth. "No business?" "Mate, hear these words. Crushed it. Like I can't tell you how insane that was," Ron said loudly. Harry picked up his egg with one arm and led a crying Hermione towards the judge's table with the other. Ron was regaling Harry's bout against the dragon back to him in excruciating detail, as if Harry hadn't just been the one to have performed it only moments ago. Upon prodding, he told the story of how Crumb had ended up in that hospital bed, though apparently it was a story much less interesting than the one of Harry slaying the dragon. Crumb had attempted a conjunctivitis curse in the eye, which hit it, but only served to infuriate the beast, who quickly recovered and fried him with a very nasty fireball. So the dragon gathers itself almost immediately, but Crumb must have thought he would have more time because he is caught in the middle of nowhere, and when the dragon blasts him, he just kind of stood there frozen. He ate a fireball just head on. When the fire subsided, he was still standing there, frozen-like, but all black and smoking. That's when the dragon handlers stepped in, but honestly, I can't see how anyone survives something like that. When they carried him off on a stretcher, his body was all rigid, and before they blew the whistle to call you out, you could hear screams coming from the healing tent, and all. Ron stopped talking just as they reached the edge of the enclosure again. The body of the dragon was still heaped in the middle, a black, convoluted mess of wings and scaly limbs. A pool of scarlet surrounded the unmoving beast. At the other end of the enclosure, Harry could see where the judges were sitting on a gilded podium. Madame Maxime raised her wand, and the number 9 formed itself high above her. "She's a bloody cheat." "That was a 10, said Ron angrily as the crowd roared. "It's marks out of 10. She gave Fleur a 5, but she didn't even dash." But Hermione hushed him. Dumbledore had raised his wand. He put up a 9 too. Harry noticed Ron did not hurl abuse at the Hogwarts headmaster. Despite granting him an identical lower score than Maxime had, he can't look partial. Ludo Bagman gave him another 10. Mr. Crouch gave him a 10. Karkaroff gave him an 8. Ron bellowed a string of very bad words at the Bulgarian headmaster. Harry didn't care at all, though. He had gotten 46 points, despite having gone in completely unprepared. He figured this must have been decent. Harry didn't care, though. He was just glad to be alive, and even more so to be on speaking terms with Hermione again. After receiving his points, he was directed to meet Bagman in the tent again, before he would be dismissed for the day. Upon re-entering the tent, the atmosphere was somewhat different from how it had been before the task. Fleur sat in one corner, angry tears streaming down her face, and heavy bandages strewn across her body. Victor Crumb was nowhere to be seen. "Well done, champions," said Ludo Bagman, though he seemed to mostly be speaking to Harry. He looked incredibly pleased, as if one of the 3 champions hadn't just possibly died before the first task even had concluded. "Now, just a few quick things before you are free to go enjoy your triumphs." Fleur let out a huff. Bagman ignored this, still looking as happy as if he himself just tied a lead with Harry. "Those golden eggs you're holding," Bagman indicated to the one egg present in the room, the one in Harry's arms. "Well, that one it opens. Inside there is a clue for the second task. You need to solve the clue before February the 24th. That's when the next task takes place. So, in order to prepare, you need to solve the clue inside the egg. Oh, also Durmstrang will be allowed to enter names anew from this afternoon. Can't have a Triwizard tournament with just 2 champions. Now can we? Excuses. I didn't get my egg, Mr. Bagman. Ludo Bagman offered her a wide smile. Oh, well, no do-overs in this competition, I'm afraid. I'm sure you'll manage. Fleur looked positively outraged. And with that, he turned on his heel and disappeared from the tent. Harry glanced at Fleur. She ignored him, though he caught her stealing a glance at the golden egg he was holding before she too disappeared from the tent. Harry eventually left the tent too and rejoined Ron and Hermione. Harry, Ron, and Hermione made to walk back to the school, when Hermione stopped in her tracks with a strange look. Wait, is that the sword of Gryffindor? Harry gave her a smirk. He felt considerably better compared to an hour ago. He figured maybe his smile was even genuine this time. Harry started to tell the story of how Ginny had given him the sorting hat moments before the first task, essentially saving him from certain death, but never got past Bagman's introduction for all the interruptions by other students congratulating Harry, or in other ways sought interaction with him. He had to decline a whole string of boys and girls asking if they could hold his sword, until Ron had enough and started hurling abuse at anyone who looked like they intended to interrupt them again. It didn't work very well for the salient reasons. The primary was that Ron didn't hold enough abuse in him to fend off a first year for the time being, and second of all, he very much enjoyed the attention himself too. The days after Harry's success in the first task, the school took a turn for the weird, to Harry's taste. First of all, it seemed that half the school had joined the fencing club. The fencing club, who up until days ago had consisted mostly of ghosts and a number of first years too afraid of ghosts to decline their recruiting efforts, had exploded in numbers and were now the largest student society in the castle. Madame Pomfrey found herself treating cuts and slashes on tens of students each night, who it seemed refused to neither don protective gear nor stop using swords with live edges. The fencing society was so delighted about this turn of events they renamed themselves the Thrashing Horntail, and started pestering Harry to come join their club every chance they got. It got so bad Harry started checking the map before heading down for breakfast to plot a route free of fencers on his way to classes or breakfast. Only issue was they seemed to multiply each night. Another surprising effect of his display with the Horntail was that it seemed a lot of girls in the castle had gained an interest in finding excuses to walk next to him. Mostly this was okay, although it annoyed Hermione very much when they wouldn't stop giggling at every word he said. Harry found himself longing for how things had been before the task, as annoying as people had been around him then. Another thing Harry noted was that despite Malfoy's best efforts, he really struggled to mock Harry over much of anything at the moment. It seemed Malfoy was also very impressed, though he tried his best at digging that part of himself as deep as he possibly could. No doubt such feelings distressed Malfoy a lot. Dumbledore. The excitement over the Triwizard tournament was still thick in the air, and while at breakfast Harry found himself the subject of more than a few glances from nearby tables. He tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the toast he was buttering. When Colin Creevey came bounding up to their table, his face lit with excitement. "Harry," Colin called, holding out a small piece of parchment. "Professor Dumbledore asked me to give you this." Harry blinked and took the note, curiosity sparking in his chest. "Yeah, thanks, Colin." Colin gave an enormous smile. "He said you would understand." "Oh, and he told me to tell you he likes sherbet lemon?" Colin beamed, clearly hoping for some more details. But when Harry didn't offer any, he shrugged and hurried off, leaving Harry holding the folded parchment. He exchanged a puzzled glance with Ron and Hermione before unfolding the note. "Harry, I believe you have something that belongs to me. Meet me at 6 o'clock in my study. Albus Dumbledore." Harry frowned, reading it over again. "I think he's talking about the sword and the sorting hat," he muttered. He had kept both since the first task, but only now did it occur to him that Dumbledore might want them back. "What's it say?" Ron asked, his mouth half full of sausage. Harry handed the note over. "He wants me to meet him in his office tonight." "Probably," Hermione said, nodding. "You've had it for days now." I imagine he noticed. "Yeah, but why didn't he just come by the common room or send someone to pick it up?" Ron asked, glancing between Harry and the note. "He could have had McGonagall ask for it during class or something." Harry shrugged, feeling a knot of unease settle in his stomach. "Maybe there's more to it. You don't think I'm in trouble, do you? I mean, I didn't do anything wrong, did I?" Well, you stole the sorting hat, Hermione replied, though her brow furrowed in thought. Well, I suppose Ginny did, but he usually doesn't mind too much about such things. Maybe he wants to talk to you about something else. The tournament, perhaps? Could be, Harry said, glancing around the hall again, noticing the way students kept casting admiring glances his way. But, I don't know. Everyone's been acting weird since the first task. Not weird, mate, Ron corrected, grinning. Ecstatic. You decapitated a dragon. No one's done anything like that before. Harry smiled, a little sheepish, but secretly enjoying the attention. The school had been buzzing about it for days. For once, the looks and whispers weren't about something bad he had done. In fact, it felt pretty good hearing the admiration. He still wasn't sure how to feel about all the praise, but it was better than the usual gossip that surrounded him. Still, Hermione said a bit more seriously, Dumbledore doesn't send notes like this unless there's something important. Maybe he wants to check in after the task? He might be concerned. Before Harry could respond, Ron leaned in. Did you hear about Crumb? Got sent to St. Mungo's. Harry's eyes widened. St. Mungo's? Really? Yeah, Ron confirmed, lowering his voice. Hagrid was talking about it this morning. Crumb's not coming back anytime soon. I'm not surprised, Hermione said quietly. I mean, did you see what happened? He was rigid after that blast of dragon fire. Honestly, I'm shocked he even made it out alive. Ron grimaced. The way they lifted him off. Looked like a statue. Blimey. Harry felt a sinking sensation in his stomach. He knew how close he had come to serious injury himself. What if Ginny hadn't slipped him the sorting hat at the last minute? He shoved the thought aside, not wanting to dwell on it. Apparently Durmstrang is getting another shot at it, Ron said. Durmstrang's going to have another go with the goblet tonight. See if it picks a new champion. Harry frowned. A second champion? Feels like they're bending the rules a bit. Ron snorted. Karkaroff's probably bending Dumbledore's ear about it. Won't let Durmstrang go down without a fight. The day passed slowly after that. Between classes, students stopped Harry in the corridors to congratulate him or make some comment about how unbelievable his performance during the task had been. He tried to keep his head down, but he found himself smiling more often than not. As much as he tried to downplay it, the praise felt good. It wasn't often people were happy to see him succeed. Still, there was the looming question of Dumbledore's meeting. The note had left Harry uneasy, and as the day wore on, he couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just returning the sword. During lunch, there was a small buzz around the absence of Professor Moody. Defense against the dark arts had been canceled, which was rare, and nobody seemed to know where he was. Moody's missing now, too? Harry muttered as they sat down at the Gryffindor table. That's strange. Maybe he's busy with something for Dumbledore, Hermione suggested. Or a business, perhaps? Or, Ron said darkly, he's hunting down whoever put your name in the goblet. Harry felt a chill at that, but before he could respond, a group of third years stopped by to congratulate him again on his win. As much as he hated the idea of someone trying to sabotage him, the cheers and admiration from his fellow students distracted him just enough to push the darker thoughts aside. By the time the afternoon rolled around, Harry's mind was still swirling with questions. What did Dumbledore really want? Was it just about the sword? Or was there something more? The excitement and praise had helped ease his nerves throughout the day. But now, as he made his way toward the headmaster's office, the weight of the note felt heavier in his pocket. Finally, Harry found himself standing before the stone gargoyle. He reached into his robes, pulling out the crumpled note one last time, his thumb brushing over the neat signature at the bottom. The stone gargoyle taunted Harry for a long time when Harry had no password to produce for it, until it eventually sighed deeply and asked him if perhaps the headmaster maybe mentioned some sort of confectionery items he is currently fond of. Harry remembered the enigmatic thing Colin had said to him earlier. Je pas les mons. The statue sighed deeply again, muttered close enough, and moved to the side. Harry climbed the staircase and knocked on the door to the headmaster's office. A painting behind Harry that he hadn't noticed before spoke to him in a kind voice. You can go in. He's not there, but he asked me to tell you to go right on in, dear. Oh, okay. Harry pushed open the door and entered the strange office of the headmaster. Apart from the strange noises from various instruments around the office was deserted. Harry put the sword of Gryffindor down on the headmaster's desk, along with the sorting hat, for the second time in his life. And just like last time, he was covered in blood and muck. "Where'd you get that, boy?" Harry looked up. One of the paintings of the headmasters had spoken. The painting cleared its throat and repeated the question. "I'd rather not say." "Good lad. Wouldn't want to get the little redhead in any trouble, would you?" The painting gave a good-natured chuckle. Harry blinked. "If you knew they why. How'd your first task go?" "Well, I'm here and I." The portrait huffed. "You are indeed. What of the beast?" "Dead. Cut its head off." "Very good, lad." The door to Dumbledore's study opened, and the headmaster entered. "Congratulations, Harry. That was very well executed." "Thank you, sir. And thank you for returning the sorting hat. Our first years of next term start will be immensely grateful. Though something tells me our dear sorting hat has been criminally underutilized for a very long time. Well, it's great for producing weapons, Professor. Not for just anyone, I'm afraid." "Sir, well, take me for instance. For as many hours I have spent with that hat, it never produced so much as a toothpick for me. Now, of course I was not sorted into Gryffindor, as you were, so it might of course be the case that it truly only answers to, well, Gryffindor students. Sir, were you in any danger when you tried?" Dumbledore paused for a long time. A small smile crept upon his face. "Sometimes, my dear boy, and it is very rare, I feel truly stupid. No, I wasn't. I'll have to add that particular circumstance to the equation at my earliest convenience." Dumbledore took a seat behind his desk, looked up with a serene smile. "Ah, Harry," he said, gesturing for him to sit. "Thank you for coming." Harry nodded, feeling a flutter of nerves as he placed the sword of Gryffindor and the slightly crumpled sorting hat on Dumbledore's desk. Dumbledore smiled kindly as he accepted them. "Do let Miss Weasley know next time all she needs do is knock." Harry froze for a second. He felt his face grow warm. Dumbledore watched him in silence for a moment before leaning forward slightly, his gaze gentle. "Ginevra Weasley gave you the hat before the task, did she not?" Harry swallowed hard, his heart sinking. Dumbledore already knew. "And as for Miss Delacour," Dumbledore continued, his voice soft, "I am well aware that she had a hand in you entering the tournament, though I suspect she did not realize she was entering a minor. You show quite the talent for having witches around you do your bidding." Harry's stomach twisted with guilt. "If you're going to punish anyone, Dumbledore held up a hand, stopping him. "Harry," he said gently, "neither Miss Weasley nor Miss Delacour are in any trouble. In fact, I find it admirable that your first concern is for their well-being, rather than your own. It speaks to your loyalty, your protectiveness." Harry blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected compliment. He had been certain he was going to face consequences for what had happened, and that Ginny, who had taken a huge risk by stealing the hat for him, would be in even bigger trouble. But Dumbledore didn't seem remotely upset. "You should know," Dumbledore continued, his voice calm, "that I am not in the habit of punishing those who act out of friendship and bravery. Ginevra saw an opportunity to help you, and she took it. Miss Delacour was misled, yes, but you acted in the heat of the moment, under pressures that few your age can comprehend. No harm has been done." Harry shifted in his seat, feeling a mixture of relief and embarrassment. I didn't think everything would turn out like it did. I was just trying to get through the task. I didn't mean to drag anyone else into it." Dumbledore's smile softened, and he placed the sword of Gryffindor back on his desk, the gleaming blade catching the light. "You have shouldered many burdens, Harry, more than most, but you must learn to forgive yourself for those things that are beyond your control. You did what you felt was necessary, and now we move forward." Harry let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, nodding slowly. He was glad that Ginny wouldn't be facing any trouble, but the conversation with Dumbledore had left him feeling exposed, as if the headmaster had seen straight through every defense Harry had tried to put up. Dumbledore leaned back in his chair again, folding his hands in his lap. Harry hesitated for a moment, then slowly began speaking. I. No, there were two notes, Professor. My name came out twice. So really, I didn't do anything all that bad, did I? My name was going to come out either way." Dumbledore's eyes sparkled with amusement. "Quite an observation, Harry. Indeed, your name would have emerged from the goblet regardless of your actions with Miss Delacour. Your second entry in the tournament was the result of someone else's dangerous intentions, I'm afraid. Harry frowned. Do you know who it was? Dumbledore's expression didn't change, but Harry sensed a shift in the air. What I can tell you, Harry, is that the magic binding the Goblet of Fire is ancient and powerful. To interfere with its workings, to place a name well, such an act carries consequences. Harry's curiosity deepened. Consequences? You mean for the person who entered my name? What exactly happens to them? Harry asked. Do you know? Dumbledore watched him for a moment. Harry's mind was still racing with questions, but one thought suddenly came to the forefront. Professor, where's Professor Moody? Defense Against the Dark Arts was canceled today, and no one's seen him. Dumbledore's expression shifted, becoming serious. Dumbledore hesitated, then leaned forward, his voice lower and more deliberate. Continue, Harry. Was it Professor Moody? Harry didn't quite believe his own words as he said them. What I am about to tell you, Harry, is not for anyone else's ears. It must remain strictly between us. Harry nodded quickly, leaning in closer, sensing the gravity of the situation. The man you know as Alastor Moody, Dumbledore said quietly, is not in fact Alastor Moody. Harry's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? The real Alastor Moody was taken some time ago, Dumbledore explained. An imposter took his place, a Death Eater. This imposter has been posing as Moody since the start of term, but I've been aware of the deception for some time and kept an eye on him. Harry's eyes widened in shock. How? Dumbledore's gaze was steady. There are certain ways that Alastor and I confirm our identities when we meet. Secret signals, if you will. I needed time, Harry. Time to understand what he was planning and to ensure that the real Moody was safe and where he was. I was afraid a confrontation could mean the certain death of Alastor Moody. Harry's mind was spinning. So, where's Moody now? Rescued, Dumbledore said simply. He is recovering and will return to his post on Monday. The imposter, meanwhile, is facing the consequences of his actions. Dumbledore nodded solemnly. Yes, the magical contract has begun to unravel for him. He will not survive much longer. We are doing what we can to prolong and reverse what can be reversed. Harry swallowed hard. What happens now? For now, Dumbledore said, rising from his chair, we wait. Moody will return, and this matter will soon be resolved. But you must tell no one, Harry. Not even Miss Granger or Mr. Weasley. Harry nodded slowly, still reeling from the revelation. I won't. Dumbledore smiled kindly, placing a hand on Harry's shoulder. You've done well, Harry. We will speak again soon. Until then, I suggest you get some rest. There is much still to come. With that, Dumbledore dismissed him, and Harry left the office, his mind spinning with everything he had just learned. Saucy Midnight Encounters. Author's note. Can anyone spot the movie I ripped the lake encounter from? Shameless. Bonus points if you can. A chapter explaining how we ended up here will come before this one, but I figured some sauce was needed. The morning air in the entrance hall was crisp and cool, the sunlight streaming in through the tall windows casting golden patches on the stone floor. Harry, Ron, and Hermione had just finished breakfast and were making their way out, Ron still chewing the last bit of toast he'd nicked from the Gryffindor table. Did you see that new guy, Ivan, today? Ron asked, his voice muffled through his mouthful. Reckon he's even thinking about practicing for the second task? He looked dead on his feet after being picked. Hermione rolled her eyes. He's probably working just as hard as everyone else, Ron. Honestly, just because Before she could finish, a voice cut through the hall, drawing all three of them to a halt. Harry! Harry turned, already recognizing the accent. Fleur Delacour stood at the foot of the staircase, her silver blonde hair gleaming in the morning light. Her robes were light blue as usual, swishing elegantly around her as she crossed the hall with an easy grace. Several students nearby were openly staring at her as she approached, but Fleur seemed utterly unaware of the attention. Fleur, Harry said awkwardly as she stopped in front of him, offering a dazzling smile. I was wondering, Fleur said, her voice lilting. Could we talk? In private? Her blue eyes flicked momentarily to Ron and Hermione before returning to Harry, and her smile widened. Sure, Harry said, feeling slightly thrown. He glanced at Ron and Hermione. I'll catch up with you in a minute. Ron raised his eyebrows, clearly impressed that Fleur Delacour was taking Harry aside. Yeah, all right, he said, giving Harry a knowing look before heading off. Hermione, however, lingered for a moment, frowning as she glanced between Harry and Fleur. Then, without a word, she turned on her heel and followed Ron. As Harry watched them go, he couldn't help but feel slightly uneasy, but Fleur's voice brought him back. Shall we? She said, nodding toward a quieter corner near the great arched doorway. Harry followed her, wondering what this could possibly be about. When they reached the far side of the hall, Fleur turned to him, her smile softening as she leaned slightly closer. I wanted to speak with you, Harry, she began, her voice low and almost musical. About YEA tournament. Oh, Harry said, nodding quickly. Right, of course. But then Fleur didn't seem to continue. Instead, she gave him an appraising look, her gaze lingering on his face, as if waiting for him to say something more. Harry shifted uncomfortably, glancing down at his shoes. So, what is it you wanted to talk about? He asked after a moment, trying to ignore the odd flutter in his stomach. Fleur let out a light laugh, the sound delicate, and her fingers lightly brushed her hair back from her face. Oh, nothing important, she said, shrugging one shoulder. I simply wanted to, how do you say, check in with you? See how you were managing. Harry blinked. Managing? With the tournament? Yes, Fleur replied smoothly, though her smile seemed almost too perfect. Zay's second task is approaching, and it is, of course, important that we all prepare. I know you are young, but you have been through so much already, no? Harry gave a quick, awkward nod. Yeah, I guess so. It's been tough, but I think I'm figuring it out. Fleur's eyes seemed to linger on him longer than necessary, and Harry suddenly felt very aware of how close they were standing. She tilted her head slightly, her smile almost teasing. You are quite brave, Harry. Not many your age would be able to handle this. Harry wasn't sure what to say. He felt a heat creeping up the back of his neck and fidgeted with the hem of his robes. Thanks, he muttered, not quite meeting her gaze. But, I don't really have a choice. Fleur's smile didn't waver, but there was something in her eyes now, something that made Harry's pulse quicken. Still, she said softly, it is impressive. You have a certain strength about you. The words felt strange, and for a moment, Harry wasn't sure if this was a genuine conversation or something else entirely. Fleur wasn't asking him for advice or discussing strategy, she was just standing there, smiling at him, her tone oddly flirty. He shifted again, uncomfortable but unable to figure out why. Before he could respond, Fleur's eyes flicked past him, as if she had spotted someone coming. Her smile grew a little sharper. But I must go, she said quickly, her voice airy again. We will talk again soon, yes? She slipped him a note and told him to open it after classes. And with that, she turned on the spot and walked off, her silvery hair whipping behind her. Sure, Harry said, still confused, as Fleur gave him a quick nod and glided off, leaving him standing alone by the doorway. He stood there for a moment, replaying the conversation in his mind, trying to figure out what exactly had just happened. Harry frowned, shaking his head. He had no idea what to make of it, but he felt a growing sense of relief that it was over. He slipped the note into his pocket. Harry turned and hurried back toward the staircase, heading in the direction Ron and Hermione had gone. As he turned the corner, the voices of Ron and Hermione echoed in the deserted hallway. Ugh! She's only talking to him because he is the only one with a clue for the next task. Just don't ruin it for him, please. Ron, I wouldn't. Yeah, right? Just look at how she flicked her hair at him. What a total slag. When they heard Harry approaching, they quickly changed the subject. Feeling slightly embarrassed, Harry tried to act casual as he rejoined them. What was all that about? Ron asked, grinning at Harry as soon as he appeared. You look like you were having quite the chat. Yeah, well, it was weird, Harry muttered. She didn't even want anything really. Just asked how I was doing with the tournament. She was acting. I don't know. Oh, Ron let out a low whistle. Maybe she fancies you, mate. Could you imagine? Fleur Delacour and Harry Potter. The Daily Prophet would have a field day. Harry snorted, shoving Ron lightly. Shut up, Ron. Ron laughed, but Hermione, walking ahead of them, said nothing. Harry glanced at her, noting the stiffness in her posture. What's wrong, Hermione? Nothing. Hermione replied tersely, not turning around. Ron raised his eyebrows at Harry, clearly noticing the shift in her mood too. You sure? You seem off. I said I'm fine. Hermione snapped, quickening her pace. Harry frowned. Are you sure? Because honestly, Harry, Hermione interrupted, her tone clipped. Just leave it, okay? Harry and Ron exchanged another look, both at a loss for what had triggered Hermione's sudden bad mood. She didn't normally get like this without reason, but she was clearly not interested in explaining. They reached the door to Charm's class, and Hermione stormed inside without waiting for them. Ron blinked after her, bewildered. What was that about? Harry shrugged helplessly, though he couldn't shake the strange feeling that had settled over the morning, first with Fleur, now with Hermione. I don't know. Maybe it's just one of those days. Yeah, maybe, Ron said, though his voice was doubtful. They entered the classroom, and Harry found himself glancing at Hermione, who had taken her seat at the front, her back still rigid. He sighed, sliding into the seat beside Ron. Author's note. I really couldn't be FD to write the passage here, so it's not there yet. Sorry, LOL. The Hogwarts grounds were eerily quiet under the silver light of the December moon. The frosty grass crunched under Harry's feet as he made his way toward the Great Lake, shivering under his cloak. Now, as the castle loomed behind him, silent and shadowy. You came, she said quietly, her French accent curling around the words. Yeah, Harry replied, feeling the cold air bite at his cheeks. It's freezing, though. Fleur gave a small laugh, the sound light and warm in the crisp air. It is cold, but cold can be exhilarating. Harry wasn't so sure. The wind cut through him as he stuffed his hands deeper into his pockets, watching as Fleur stepped closer to the lake, her feet brushing the frost-covered ground. She lifted her wand and muttered something under her breath, and instantly, the air around him warmed like a soft bubble of heat. Czar, she said, turning to Harry, you will not freeze now. Harry felt a rush of warmth wrap around him, the chill lifting instantly. He stood maybe 10 yards from her and stopped, waiting. Fleur's smile deepened, and without speaking, she reached up and unclasped her cloak, letting it fall to the ground. Underneath, she wore nothing but a thin, sleeveless dress, and Harry's stomach lurched at the sight. But before Harry could neither start nor finish his sentence, she let one of her shoulder straps slide off her shoulder, and then the other. The dress fell silently to the ground. She was completely unfazed by neither the cold nor by his presence. Her naked form shone in the soft moonlight. Harry's face turned red, and he quickly looked away. He quickly found a bush to hide behind as he fumbled with his own cloak. He could hear the soft sound of feet moving on grass, and then a sudden splash. Oh la la! It's freezing, Fleur exclaimed, her voice full of laughter. Harry peered out from behind the bush, his eyes widening as he saw Fleur swimming in the dark water, her laughter echoing across the lake. She seemed completely at ease, humming softly to herself as she floated in the icy water. Shivering slightly despite the charm, Harry hurriedly finished undressing and waded into the lake. The moment the water touched his skin, he winced at the sharp cold. Fleur's charm kept him warm, but the sensation of chill was still enough to notice. It took a moment to adjust, and Fleur laughed at his reaction. This is great, she said, her voice light and carefree as she drifted through the water. Harry waded in deeper, glancing around nervously. What if Filch catches us? Or, I don't know, someone sees us from the castle. Fleur waved her hand dismissively, splashing a bit of water in his direction. Do not worry, Harry. No one will catch us, and if they do, I can always charm them. She winked playfully. Harry, trying to ignore the warm flutter in his stomach, moved closer to where Fleur was floating. She suddenly stopped, holding her hand to her eye with a small frown. Oh, Zudalor, she muttered, her voice softer. I ave something in my eye. He swam closer to her, capitalizing on the chance to get closer. Are you all right? He asked. Fleur tilted her head up toward him, her face only inches from his. Can you see it? She asked, her voice low and teasing. Harry's throat went dry as he leaned in, trying to focus on her eyes, but it was difficult to ignore the feeling of her warm breath against his skin. I don't see anything, he stammered. Get closer, Fleur whispered. Harry leaned in, looking deeper into her eyes that seemed to pull him in, making everything else around them fade away. Then, without warning, Fleur reached out and gently grabbed his face, pressing her lips to his in a quick, playful kiss. Harry's eyes widened in shock, but before he could react, she pulled away, laughing as she splashed backward through the water. That is the first time I Ave kissed someone younger than me, Fleur teased, her laughter echoing softly. I am usually surrounded by older men. Harry blinked, his heart still pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure how to respond, so he simply floated there, watching as Fleur swam lazily through the water, her movements graceful and relaxed. She seemed completely at ease, but Harry, much more self-conscious, kept glancing back at the castle, half expecting someone to come down and catch them at any moment. After a while, Fleur swam back toward the shallows, wading gracefully out of the water. Harry watched, embarrassed, as she glanced back at him and caught his gaze lingering too long. He quickly looked away, his face burning. Do not be shy, Harry, she said with a playful smile. It is nothing you have not seen before. Well, do you know, Harry thought to himself, it definitely was not something he had seen before. Harry awkwardly followed her to the shore, doing his best to cover himself as he waded out of the water. Fleur giggled at his attempts, her laughter warm and teasing. Oh, Harry, and you a champion. Still smiling, Fleur reached for her cloak, wrapping it around her as she stood shivering slightly in the cold night air. Her wet hair clung to her shoulders, and as she struggled to dry herself, Harry hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward. Let me warm you up, he said quietly, reaching out to pull her closer. Fleur looked at him, her expression softening for a moment as she allowed herself to be drawn into his embrace. Harry wrapped his arms around her, rubbing her back briskly, the thin fabric of her cloak the only thing between them. But as his hands slowed, becoming more gentle, more deliberate, Fleur stiffened slightly. Do not spoil it, she whispered, her voice kind but firm. She looked up at him with a knowing smile, her eyes filled with understanding. I want this to be a perfect night. Harry, realizing what she meant, nodded, his heart sinking slightly as he pulled back, loosening his grip. Fleur smiled, her expression wistful as she looked out over the lake. I have not had a real night like this since I was young, she said quietly, her voice soft and almost sad. Sometimes I wish I could go back to that time. Harry watched her, unsure of what to say. In that moment, Fleur seemed younger somehow, her usual confidence and poise replaced with something more fragile, more vulnerable. Without thinking, Harry stepped back, allowing her space as she buttoned her cloak. Fleur glanced at him, then, with a sudden impulse, leaned forward and kissed him gently on the lips. The kiss was soft, sweet, and brief, lasting only a few seconds, but it felt innocent, like a fleeting moment from a simpler time. When she pulled away, she smiled at him, radiant and wistful at the same time. That was nice, Fleur said softly, her eyes twinkling. I do not get kissed much, you know. Harry, still a bit dazed from the kiss, nodded awkwardly. Fleur smiled again, her face brightening as she stood, pulling her cloak tighter around her. So, Harry, she said, her voice returning to its light, teasing tone. What do we do now? Harry looked at her, reluctant to leave the peacefulness of the night, but knowing that they couldn't stay here forever. With a deep breath, he shrugged. I guess we head back. Fleur laughed softly, nodding as she began walking toward the path back to the Beauxbatons carriage. Harry followed, his mind still buzzing from the night, unsure of what to make of it all. As they reached the carriage, Fleur paused and turned to him, her eyes soft and grateful. Bonne nuit, Harry, she whispered, leaning in to kiss him once more on the cheek before slipping inside the carriage. Harry stood there for a moment, staring after her, his heart still racing. Then, with a final glance back at the moonlit lake, he mounted his broom and flew back up to the Gryffindor common room, slipping in through the window as the embers of the fire glowed faintly in the darkened room. As Harry climbed into bed, his mind whirled with the memory of Fleur's kiss, the warmth of her embrace, and the strange mix of emotions that left him feeling both enchanted and confused. Something had changed tonight, something he couldn't quite name. And as he lay there, staring at the ceiling, he realized he would never forget it. The second task. Author's note. Whoa, time travel. All of a sudden we've skipped like 5 chapters. How did that happen? The lead up to the second task of the Triwizard tournament was a blur of nervous energy and frantic preparation. Ever since Harry had cracked the clue from the golden egg, he had known what was coming. A rescue mission deep beneath the Black Lake. The task itself was terrifying, but the real dread came from the fact that he had nothing. No spell, no potion, no plan to actually breathe underwater. Days had slipped by faster than he could prepare, and now he stood on the shore of the lake, the bitter February wind biting through his robes, feeling utterly unprepared. The other champions weren't faring much better. Fleur Delacour stood a little way off, her silvery blonde hair tied back tightly, but the usual grace and poise she carried seemed dimmed. She was speaking quietly with Madame Maxime, her brow furrowed in concern. Beside them was Ivan Colio, the new Durmstrang champion, a broad-shouldered, grim-looking wizard who had been chosen after Victor Crumb's tragic death following the first task. His face was pale, and there was a haunted look in his eyes that made Harry wonder whether he, too, had seen more than he had bargained for. The atmosphere around them was tense. The Beauxbatons and Durmstrang contingents weren't cheering or buzzing with excitement as they had before. They seemed subdued, their faces pale against the gray sky. It didn't help that the Hogwarts crowd, by contrast, was positively electric. The stands were packed, and students were waving banners and flags, the Gryffindor lions roaring in the cold wind. The festive atmosphere clashed starkly with the reality of what they were about to do: dive into the freezing Black Lake and rescue people they cared about from the depths below. Harry swallowed hard, trying to stay focused. Free the hostage. Get out of the lake. He repeated the mantra over and over in his head, willing himself to keep it together. His heart was pounding, and the cold was already starting to seep into his bones. As the seconds ticked closer to the task, Ludo Bagman approached Harry, his usual boisterous grin faltering slightly. "All set, Harry, my boy?" he asked, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "Big moment this. Second task. Quite the spectacle." Harry nodded, though the tight knot in his stomach only twisted further. "Yeah, about as ready as I'll ever be." Bagman glanced around quickly, his eyes darting to make sure no one else was listening, then leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You know, if you're in need of a bit of advice, I've got a few tricks up my sleeve. Help a lad out, eh? Wouldn't want to go in blind, would we?" Harry blinked, caught off guard. Part of him wanted to say yes, to take the help Bagman was offering. He'd been going in circles for days, trying to figure out how he was supposed to breathe underwater, and now there was no time left. But another part of him recoiled. There was something about Bagman's eagerness that made him uneasy, a gnawing suspicion that accepting help from him might come at a price. Harry started, but the words caught in his throat. He hesitated, his mind racing. Before he could answer, the whistle blew, sharp and loud, signaling that it was time. Bagman clapped him on the back, all pretense of secrecy gone, as he straightened up with a beaming grin. "Good luck, Harry. Show him what you're made of." The crowd erupted into cheers, and Harry was swept forward by the momentum of the moment, his feet carrying him to the water's edge. There was no time now, no second thoughts. He would have to do it his way, no matter how underprepared he felt. His eyes flicked to Fleur and Ivan. Neither of them looked particularly ready. Fleur's face was pale, and her lips were pressed into a thin, determined line. Ivan looked downright sick, his eyes fixed on the lake as if he were staring down his worst nightmare. There was none of the confidence or swagger they'd shown in the first task. Harry wondered if they had even solved the clue from the egg. Did they know what lay beneath the lake? Did they know they were supposed to save something dear to them? The stands were still roaring with excitement, but the tension between the champions was palpable. It hung in the cold air like a thick fog, and Harry could feel it tightening around his chest. He took a deep breath, the freezing air burning his lungs, and stepped up to the starting point. He tried to recall the charm Fleur had used to make the cold bearable. "Champions, take your positions," came the magically amplified voice of Ludo Bagman. Harry's heart raced as he bent down to remove his shoes and socks, his breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. His eyes were fixed on the dark, choppy waters of the lake. The thought of diving into that freezing abyss sent a shiver down his spine, but there was no choice. He glanced over at Fleur one more time. She caught his eye, offering him a brief, tight smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. She looked just as nervous as he felt. 3, 2, 1. The whistle blew, and without thinking, Harry dove forward into the icy water. The cold hit him like a wall, stealing the breath from his lungs and making every muscle in his body seize. He kicked hard, trying to fight the shock, but his limbs felt like lead as the freezing lake water wrapped around him. He could feel the weight of the crowd's cheers behind him, muffled by the water. But in his mind, there was only one thought: free the hostage. Get out of the lake. With a deep breath, he dived without thinking head first into the water. It was not a graceful dive, more of a forward collapse. He had never been very good with water. The freezing water of the black lake closed over Harry like an icy fist, and every instinct screamed at him to go back to the surface. The shock of the cold hit him hard, and the weight of the task ahead made him feel even heavier as he kicked downward, forcing himself into the inky depths. The February chill seeped into his bones, numbing his limbs almost instantly, but he pushed on, his heart pounding in his chest. Free the hostage, get out of the lake. He repeated the thought over and over, his mind clinging to that one goal as his body struggled to cope with the icy water. His strokes were uneven, his legs kicking feebly against the dense cold. He could barely see anything now the surface had disappeared, leaving him surrounded by blackness. Each kick dragged him farther down, but the pressure in his chest was unbearable, his lungs screaming for air. "I'm not going to make it." Panic shot through him as the need to breathe became all-consuming. His throat spasmed violently, his mouth opening involuntarily, and water rushed in, filling his mouth and nose. His vision blurred. His thoughts grew chaotic. And then, in that moment of pure desperation, the water around him folded, an impossible sensation of everything collapsing inward. Suddenly, he wasn't where he had been. He was deeper than he should have been. The pressure slammed into him with terrifying force, crushing his chest. He flailed wildly, his limbs uncoordinated and sluggish in the frigid water. And then came the sharp, stabbing pain in his ears, like knives piercing his skull. His eardrums ruptured, and with it came a horrible rushing sensation, as if the cold water was pouring straight into his brain. Harry's vision spun, the world tilting violently as disorientation hit him like a sledgehammer. His sinuses filled with freezing water, and his equilibrium was shot. He had no sense of up or down, no sense of direction. He was drowning. There was no air, just the freezing, suffocating water. He was going to die here, deep in the black, cold silence. Free the hostage. Get out of the lake. The mantra played on repeat, a desperate lifeline in his otherwise panicked mind. He had to do it. He had to at least try. His body was moving on instinct now, limbs flailing in the dark, his throat constricting painfully as his lungs begged for oxygen. And then he saw it, a faint, ghostly outline in the pitch-black water. It was a person tethered to the lakebed by thick ropes. He couldn't tell who it was. His vision was blurry, his senses distorted, but he didn't care. He had to act. His shaking hands reached out, fingers fumbling for the knife in his belt. His chest spasmed violently as his lungs seized, and the thought struck him again like a cruel taunt. I'm dying. I'm going to die. His frozen fingers struggled to grip the knife, but finally, he managed to pull it free. He slashed at the ropes, his movements frantic, his body thrashing as his strength ebbed. The ropes felt like iron in his hands, but he hacked away at them, the pressure in his head building, the buzzing in his ears unbearable. Free the hostage. Get out of the lake. The rope finally gave way, and the limp body of the hostage floated free. Harry grabbed her, his head spinning with disorientation. He tried to pull her upward, but there was no up anymore. There was just blackness, and the agony in his chest, and the endless cold. Then something bumped against him, another body. Hermione. Through the pain, he recognized the bushy hair swirling in the water beside him, her face pale and peaceful as she floated, tethered by thick ropes just like the first hostage. Panic clawed at him again, and his already frozen fingers trembled uncontrollably. His vision was failing, darkness crept in at the edges as he fought the urge to breathe. His throat was spasming violently, his chest collapsing in on itself. Free the hostage. Get out of the lake. Harry slashed blindly at the ropes binding Hermione, his mind fading, his body breaking down as the cold and pressure overwhelmed him. His lungs burned, his throat tightened like a vice, and the pain in his head was like nothing he'd ever felt before. The sharp, stabbing agony in his ears combined with the swirling disorientation made it impossible to think. His thoughts were slipping, his limbs growing weaker. He had no idea where the surface was anymore. The rope finally gave way, and Hermione drifted free. But it didn't matter. He was out of time. Harry's body convulsed as his lungs gave in, and he drew in a choking, desperate breath, only there was no air, just freezing lake water flooding his throat. The pain was unimaginable. His lungs seized as the water filled them, and in that moment, he knew it was over. I'm going to die. And then everything shifted again. The water collapsed in on itself, folding space like before. He wasn't swimming anymore. He was being pulled, yanked upward as if the lake itself had decided to spit him out. He felt his body spinning, flipping through the water, and then Harry crashed on a solid ground. The sudden shock of cold air hit his face, but he couldn't breathe. His body convulsed violently, and he rolled onto his side, coughing and retching as water spewed from his mouth. His throat burned, his lungs screaming in agony as they expelled what felt like gallons of lake water. He was dimly aware of the rocky shore beneath him, the freezing February air cutting into his skin, but it all felt distant, unreal. His vision was still blurred, his limbs shaking uncontrollably. All he could hear was a horrible buzzing in his ears, a crackling noise like a broken radio. His ruptured eardrums made everything sound wrong, distorted, like he was trapped in some nightmarish static-filled void. He coughed again, his body heaving as more water poured from his mouth, but still, he couldn't make out much else. There were figures next to him, Hermione and the other hostage, their pale bodies lying still on the shore, but his vision was fading, his consciousness slipping away. Harry awoke to a sharp, piercing pain in his ears, as though someone was driving needles into his head. His surroundings were a blur of noise and movement, shouting, the lapping of water, the distant murmur of voices, but none of it sounded quite right. His hearing was muffled and broken, as though he was underwater again. Through the haze, he saw Madame Pomfrey leaning over him, her wand aimed at his ear. He saw her blurry mouth move, but her voice came across as static. There was another sharp pain, and Harry winced as a sharp sensation deep in his head seared through him, the muffled buzzing slowly clearing. The noise around him came back in a rush, the shouts, the rustling of blankets, the howling wind from the lake. Before he could react, Pomfrey pushed a steaming potion into his hands. Drink this, she ordered, her tone brisk. You've inhaled far too much water. Harry coughed weakly, but managed to down the potion, which burned as it went down, making his lungs ache even more. His breathing was still labored, every breath a struggle as his body fought to recover from the freezing depths of the lake. He blinked and looked around, trying to gather his bearings. Next to him, a small, pale girl with soaking silver hair was sobbing hysterically, tears streaming down her face. She was shivering, her tiny body trembling uncontrollably as she kept repeating something in rapid French. Maman, maman, où est maman? Harry blinked in confusion, not recognizing the girl at all. He had no idea who she was, but she seemed terrified, her cries growing more desperate by the second. On his other side, Hermione sat dripping wet, her hair hanging in sopping tendrils around her face. Despite the chaos, she looked remarkably composed, though her expression was one of deep concern. Harry, she said softly, leaning in closer. Are you all right? Yeah, he croaked, though his throat felt raw. His ribs ached as if he'd been punched repeatedly, and the burning in his lungs hadn't fully gone away, but he managed to nod. What would happen? Hermione shook her head, still looking bewildered. I don't know. Last I recall, I was in Dumbledore's office, with her and another woman. She nodded toward the silver-haired girl. Harry saw Professor McGonagall walking towards them across the sandy shore, looking shocked. Potter, Miss Granger, she said, her voice filled with a mixture of disbelief and concern. It's been less than 3 minutes since the task began. How in Merlin's name dash, she shook her head, as though unable to grasp what had happened. We'll have to wait for more information from the judges, but in the meantime, I suggest you rest. Blankets were draped over Harry's shoulders, and he gratefully pulled one tighter around himself, trying to fight off the violent shivers that still racked his body. Hermione was given one as well, and she sat beside him. Harry glanced over at the crying girl again. She was still sobbing, her small body curled up tightly as she rocked back and forth. Instinctively, Harry reached out, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. It's okay, he said softly, though he wasn't sure she understood him. You're safe now. The girl hiccuped, her sobs slowing as she turned her tear-streaked face toward him. She blinked, her wide, watery eyes filled with fear. Harry gave her a weak smile, even though he still felt completely out of his depth. Slowly, she calmed down, though she kept casting worried glances toward the lake. As the minutes passed, the waiting grew heavier, more tense. Every so often, Hermione would glance over at the little French girl, her face pinched with worry. Someone should really help her, Hermione muttered, looking around as if expecting someone from both batons to step in. They waited for what felt like an eternity, the bitter wind biting at their faces as the water lapped against the shore. After about 30 minutes, an alarm sounded from the judge's tent, and the crowd's chatter turned to murmurs of concern. Harry's stomach clenched. 3 marshals, dressed in deep blue robes, dived into the lake without hesitation, disappearing beneath the surface. It felt like hours passed, but it was only a few tense minutes before they reappeared, dragging Fleur from the freezing water. She looked pale, deathly pale, and her arms trembled as she clung to one of the marshals. She coughed violently, her chest heaving with each rasping breath. "Gabrielle!" she gasped, her voice hoarse and panicked. The little girl sprang to her feet and ran to Fleur, her sobs breaking out again. Fleur collapsed to her knees, clutching Gabrielle to her chest, speaking in rapid French, her words coming out in a mixture of relief and desperation. Several minutes later, again the alarm sprang. The marshals returned to the water, but this time, after some while, they pulled out a motionless form Ivan Collio, the Durmstrang champion. His body was limp, his face pale and lifeless. A heavy silence fell over the beach as the marshals laid him down on the sand. "He's drowned," the marshals called amongst themselves. The judges began arguing, their voices growing louder with every passing moment. Maxime was furious, gesturing angrily toward the judges, while Madame Pomfrey rushed over to attend to Ivan. But her expression was grim. Harry barely registered the fighting as he turned his head toward the far side of the beach. Dumbledore was speaking with several mere people who had emerged from the lake, their grayish skin glistening in the sunlight. Their expressions were confused, their hands gesturing wildly as they tried to explain something to him. Harry couldn't understand their language, but it was clear something had gone wrong. After a few minutes, Bagman stepped forward, raising his wand to his throat and casting sonorous. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called, his voice echoing across the lake. "We have witnessed an extraordinary event today. In a time of 2 minutes and 32 seconds, Harry Potter has rescued both his hostage and Miss Delacourse, using means that are, well, frankly unknown." The mere people did not even notice the hostages missing until well after Potter had returned to shore. The crowd erupted into stunned murmurs, but Bagman continued. "For this incredible feat, Harry Potter is awarded full marks 50 points. The applause was deafening, but Harry barely heard it. His mind was still spinning from the events of the morning, and his body felt like it was about to give out at any moment. Bagman went on to announce Fleur's score, awarding her 30 points for her attempt to save her sister, though she had not finished. He continued that the judges had decided that a minute's silence would be held in memory of Ivan, who had bravely perished trying to save his mother. The Durmstrang students stood together, their faces pale and mournful, while Karkaroff looked furious. He left the beach before the full minute had passed. As the minute of silence had passed, Harry noticed that Fleur was heading towards him. She ran toward him, her face streaked with tears. "Harry, merci," she cried, flinging her arms around him before he could react. Her lips pressed against his cheeks in a flurry of kisses, and Harry could barely breathe, though whether it was from the crushing hug or his own awkwardness, he couldn't tell. "You saved Gabrielle. You are a hero. Harry, a true champion." "It was nothing," Harry tried to say, his voice weak as he squirmed under her embrace. His chest tightened, and he coughed, a sharp pain shooting through his lungs. As Fleur released him, a sickening pressure welled up in his chest. He coughed again, harder this time, and a pink, frothy liquid sputtered from his mouth. She looked at him without comprehension. The world tilted, and the pain in his chest flared. His legs gave way beneath him, and the last thing he heard was the annoyed voice of Madame Pomfrey asking students to get out of her way. Aftermath of the second task. Harry awoke to the faint smell of antiseptic and the soft rustling of sheets. His head felt heavy, but the disorientation was fading quickly as he blinked and took in his surroundings. The familiar sight of the hospital wing greeted him, sunlight filtering in through the high windows, casting long shadows on the floor. He felt surprisingly okay. Tired, yes, but the deep ache in his lungs and the dizziness that had plagued him before were gone. A small vase of flowers sat on the table beside his bed, probably from Hermione, he thought. As he turned his head, his eyes were drawn down the hall to a room he'd never noticed before. The door was slightly ajar, and from within, he heard a disturbing sound, a man screaming, the kind of raw, guttural scream that sent a shiver down Harry's spine. The patient's voice was filled with agony, but the words coming out were pure nonsense, garbled and unintelligible. It sounded like he was trying to say something important, but the pain twisted his speech into jumbled, meaningless sounds. Madame Pomfrey hurried out of the room, her face pale and tight with concentration. She turned back, locking the door with 2 separate keys before pocketing them in her apron. Noticing that Harry was awake, she strode briskly over to his bed, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Ah, Potter, awake at last," she said, though there was little warmth in her voice. She gave him a quick, clinical once-over, her eyes scanning for any signs of distress. Harry, still groggy, nodded and croaked. "Who's in that room?" Pomfrey's eyes flashed with irritation. An older student who thought it'd be wise to play with magic he didn't understand, she muttered under her breath, clearly agitated. "Dangerous magic. Messing about with curses that could break your mind if you aren't careful." Harry swallowed, not sure what to say. His ears were still ringing faintly, and his curiosity was piqued, but Pomfrey didn't seem in the mood for more questions. Before he could ask anything further, she set her hands on her hips and narrowed her eyes at him. "Speaking of dangerous," she said sharply, "do you have any idea what you've put your body through, Potter?" Harry shook his head, not entirely sure where she was going with this. "Arterial gas embolism, decompression, sickness ring, any bells?" she snapped. "No, didn't think so. I had to learn about it from Muggle literature because apparently a certain idiotic competition decided it would be grand to have you lot diving to depth and back in ridiculous time constraints." Harry blinked, caught off guard by her sudden tirade. "I what?" Pomfrey's tone was stern as she continued. "You, Mr. Potter, somehow managed to evaporate every single molecule of nitrogen inside your body, essentially carbonating your lungs, liver, brain, eyeballs, and bloodstream. Congratulations, Potter. You turned yourself into the sparkling boy who lived, only because I was there to keep you alive." Harry felt the color drain from his face. Thanks." Pomfrey rolled her eyes, but nodded. "Yes, well, you're lucky to be thanking anyone right now. Rest, and try not to attempt anything equally reckless for the foreseeable future. Understood?" Harry nodded, feeling thoroughly chastised as Pomfrey marched off, leaving him alone in the quiet of the hospital wing. For a while, Harry simply lay there, his mind reeling from what Pomfrey had said. He had been close to death, closer than he had realized. Pomfrey left him alone again. once she had ascertained he wasn't about to die just yet anyway. The door creaked open a while later, and Ron slipped in, his freckled face beaming with relief. "All right, mate?" he asked, dropping into the chair beside Harry's bed. Harry nodded, though he still felt the weight of Pomfrey's lecture lingering. "Yeah, I think so. Blimey, we thought you'd be out for days," Ron said, looking him over. "You had Pomfrey in a right state. Everyone was losing it when you came flying out of the lake with 2 hostages. That was mental." Harry grinned weakly. "Yeah, well, apparently my lungs exploded, so there's that." Ron laughed, though it was clear from his expression that the humor was only half-hearted. "Still, you did it. Though I've got a bone to pick with you, you didn't even make me the hostage. Thought we were best mates." Harry raised his eyebrows, feeling a small pang of guilt. "Sorry, mate. I even know the honor was up for grabs." "Nah, I'm just messing with you," Ron said, grinning. "Dumbledore brought both of us to his office. I think Hermione's probably more valuable to you." From the doorway, Hermione's voice chimed in with mock severity. "Oh, very noble of you, Ron. How selfless," she said, crossing her arms as she entered the room. Ron shrugged, clearly pleased with himself. "Well, you know, I do what I can." Hermione took the chair on Harry's other side, looking him over with the same concern Ron had shown. "How are you feeling?" "Better, thanks," Harry said. "Pomfrey gave me the full rundown. Apparently, I managed to explode my insides by doing something." Hermione raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What did you do?" Harry hesitated, trying to put it into words. "I'm not sure exactly. I mean, I didn't cast any spell I know of. It's like I folded the water around me. It's the best way I can explain it, and somehow I appeared on the bottom of the lake. And then?" Ron asked, leaning forward eagerly. "And then I did it again, but in reverse," Harry explained. "It was really very painful," he added, as if that wasn't obvious. Hermione's face lit up with curiosity. "Shifting pressures, that's decompression sickness. How did you manage that without Dash?" Harry raised his hands in defeat. "I have no idea, Hermione. I just did it. I didn't plan on turning my insides into soda bubbles." Ron snorted. "Soda bubbles. You're mental, Harry." Harry chuckled, though his ribs twinged painfully. A faint, blood-curdling scream pierced through the calm of the hospital wing, muffled but unmistakable. Harry, Ron, and Hermione all looked toward the locked door at the far end of the room, where the sound seemed to be coming from. Ron furrowed his brow. "What's that about?" he asked, his voice low, a mix of curiosity and unease creeping in. Harry shifted in his bed, wincing slightly as he tried to sit up straighter. "Dunno. There's a patient locked in there," he said, glancing at the door again. "Pomfrey said it's an older student, but she didn't give me much more than that. Whoever it is, they've been screaming like that on and off since I woke up." Ron exchanged a glance with Hermione, who had gone pale at the sound. "Blimey, older student? Sounds more like they're torturing someone." Hermione shook her head, frowning deeply. "That's awful. I wonder what happened. Maybe some dark magic." The scream cut off as abruptly as it had begun, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Harry rubbed the back of his neck, the tension returning. "I don't know." Pomfrey seemed pretty strict about keeping it locked down, though. She even used 2 separate keys. They all sat quietly for a moment, the unease lingering between them, before Harry broke the silence again. "What about Ivan?" Harry asked, his tone quieter now, as if bracing for the answer. Ron's expression darkened. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "He drowned, mate. Durmstrang's in a right state over it. They're going to have to submit a 3rd champion for the final task. But from what I heard, the Durmstrang lot don't even want to continue. They were completely gutted about Crumb, and now the same with Ivan. But Karkaroff." Ron's face twisted in disgust. "He's still pushing them to go on? Doesn't care about anyone but himself, does he?" Hermione's eyes softened with empathy. "That's awful. I can't believe Karkaroff would still want to push them after everything that's happened. It's like the tournament's cursed." "Yeah," Ron agreed. "It's pretty grim over at Durmstrang's camp. Half of them want to pack it in, but Karkaroff won't hear of it." Harry nodded, feeling a wave of sadness. He didn't know Ivan well, But the idea of a second competitor dying for a tournament, especially one from the same school, left a bitter taste in his mouth. After a pause, he asked hesitantly, "What about Fleur? Did I mean, did I mess her up by taking her hostage?" Ron shook his head, the gloom lifting slightly as he leaned back in his chair. "No, don't worry about that. She didn't even get halfway through before she got bogged down by all sorts of aquatic creatures. She wasn't very good at this one either. At least she didn't, die." Harry frowned, remembering how confident Fleur had seemed in the water when they'd gone for that midnight swim. It didn't make sense. "That's strange, though," he said, more to himself than to Ron or Hermione. "She seemed pretty comfortable in the water before." Hermione shot him a strange look, something between curiosity and suspicion. "When were you she started, but then seemed to think better of it, closing her mouth and looking away. Harry quickly dropped the subject, feeling awkward under Hermione's gaze. Harry managed a small smile, but before he could reply, Ron added, "I heard the judges were fighting over how you did it, by the way. Whatever it was you pulled off in the lake, they've got no clue. Bagman was going on about how it was impossible, and some of the others were saying you must have used a spell that's never been recorded. And, of course, Dumbledore Ron rolled his eyes, didn't say a word. He probably knows more than he lets on. Always does." Harry opened his mouth to reply, but before he could get a word out, the doors to the hospital wing swung open, and Professor Dumbledore stepped inside. The chatter in the room stilled as Dumbledore's tall figure strode toward the locked door at the far end. He gave the trio a polite nod in greeting, but didn't stop to speak. As Dumbledore reached the locked door, he produced a key from within his robes. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. Harry caught a brief glimpse of the man inside the room. As the door swung open, Harry thought he looked too old to be a student, with pale, slightly freckled skin and a mop of fair hair. His expression, though Harry only saw it for a split second, was jarring. The door swung shut, and the lock clicked twice. "What do you reckon that's all about?" Ron asked, his voice low, his eyes glued to the door. "No idea," Harry muttered, shaking his head. He couldn't get the image of the man's wild-eyed expression out of his mind. "That door? I've never even noticed it before." Hermione leaned forward, her brow furrowed in thought. "I've never seen it either. It must be reserved for something special. Maybe one of the marshals from the Triwizard tournament was injured during one of the rescues? That might explain it." Harry glanced back at the door, uneasy. Maybe. They all fell silent, pondering the mysterious occupant of the locked room. The hospital wing was quiet again, save for the distant, muffled sounds from beyond the door. The eerie feeling hadn't left Harry, but he tried to push it out of his mind. Just as they began to relax again, the doors to the hospital wing creaked open once more. This time it was Professor Snape. His long black robes swept across the floor as he made his way quickly and silently toward the locked room. His sallow face showed no interest in Harry, Ron, or Hermione as he passed by. Without so much as a glance in their direction, he raised his wand, muttered a quick incantation, and the door to the mysterious room clicked open. He stepped inside, and like Dumbledore, the door locked twice behind him. The trio exchanged looks, each of them more perplexed than before. "What's Snape doing here?" Ron whispered, his eyes wide. "I don't know," Hermione said, shaking her head. "But whatever's going on in that room, it's serious." As Harry sat there, watching Dumbledore and Snape disappear into the locked room, a thought struck him, one that sent a cold shiver down his spine. He couldn't say it out loud, had promised Dumbledore, but it gnawed at him all the same. There had been an imposter before. The morning following the second task proved to be an interesting one, to say the least. The trio sat at breakfast when the morning edition of the Daily Prophet dropped onto the Gryffindor table with a loud thud, startling Harry out of his sleepy stupor. He blinked and yawned, reaching for a slice of toast as Ron lazily grabbed the paper and began flipping through it. But then Ron froze, his eyes widening as he scanned the headline. "Ah, Harry, mate, you're going to want to see this." Harry, still groggy, glanced over. The headline blared in bold, attention-grabbing letters. "Harry Potter, the Champion of Love. Heroic Second. Task Victory Driven by Vila Bond." Harry blinked, his stomach sinking as he scanned the page. Hermione leaned over his shoulder, raising an eyebrow, while Ron reached for a piece of toast. "Oh no," Harry muttered, flipping the paper open. His stomach dropped. "What?" Harry muttered, snatching the paper from Ron's hands. The moment his eyes landed on the article, he felt like he was doused in ice-cold water. In a breathtaking display of courage and passion, Harry Potter, Hogwarts' young champion, plunged into the icy depths of the Black Lake not just to rescue his friend, but to save the sister of his soulmate, Fleur Delacour. The pair, rumored to have forged a deep and magical connection, is whispered to be Vila bonded for life, a rare and powerful bond in which a Vila recognizes her soulmate. Delacour, who has reportedly declared her undying affection for Potter, was seen swooning with gratitude after the daring rescue. Whispers around the castle have confirmed that the two are destined to be together after Harry's daring underwater rescue of Fleur's beloved sister. The fierce connection between them is undeniable, and sources reveal that Fleur is head over heels for our hero. Harry felt the blood drain from his face. Vila bonded? Soulmates? His eyes darted further down the page. Sources from Beaux Batons have confirmed that Fleur has spoken openly of Potter as her one true love, a champion not just of magic, but of the heart. And who could blame her? With his strong frame, youthful stamina, and undeniable chemistry, the boy who lived has captured not only the Triwizard Cup, but also the affections of a striking and mysterious Vila. Harry's eyes found the image attached to the article, a moving picture of him, shirtless and absurdly muscular, carrying Fleur, who was barely dressed in a flowing, low-cut gown that covered much of anything from the lake. Fleur was draped dramatically in his arms, her hands curled into his chest as she gazed up at him with swooning adoration. It looked like something out of one of those books Petunia pretended she didn't read, but somehow always inexplicably found themselves dog-eared in the Disley coffee table. Vila bonded for life? Harry muttered, his face burning with embarrassment. His mind raced, panic settling in as a horrifying thought crossed his mind. Is Skeeter about to write about the lake? That other time? About Fleur leading him out of the castle that night? But there was no mention of that midnight encounter. He felt an uneasy wave of relief. Hermione, leaning over to read the article, snorted softly, though her expression was tight. Honestly, Vila bonded? This is ridiculous. Where does she even get this rubbish? Ron, on the other hand, was nearly doubled over with laughter. "Oh, mate," he wheezed, clutching his stomach. "You've never looked better." He pointed to the absurd image. "Look at you, all heroic. The champion of love." Harry groaned, hiding his face in his hands. "This is mortifying." Hermione's lips twitched into a smile, though she quickly masked it. "It is absurd, Harry. Don't let it get to you." But Harry couldn't help feeling uneasy. The article was bad enough, but it was the whispers and glances from the other students in the Great Hall that really made his skin crawl. He noticed a few of the younger students pointing at him, giggling behind their hands, clearly already taken in by Skeeter's latest fabrication. As they finished their breakfast, the trio started gathering their things to head to class, but they were stopped dead in their tracks by an all-too-familiar sneer. Well, if it isn't Potter and his Vila soulmate," came the mocking voice of Draco Malfoy. He strode up, brandishing his own copy of the Daily Prophet with a smirk plastered across his face. "What's it like, Potter, knowing you've already got your life partner sorted out? Fleur Delacour swooning at your feet, what a hero." Harry clenched his jaw, fighting to keep his temper in check. Ron scowled. "Shove off, Malfoy." Malfoy's smirk widened as he glanced at the paper again. "Honestly, Potter, it's quite touching. A real love story. Shame you had to throw yourself at some foreign bird just to get a bit of attention. Guess none of the Hogwarts girls were interested." Before Harry or Ron could retort, a sudden crack filled the air, followed by a flash of blue light. Malfoy was blasted off his feet, crashing into a nearby table with a yelp of pain. Harry turned, startled, to see a Beaux Baton student standing with her wand raised, fury blazing in her eyes. She pointed a shaking finger at Malfoy, who was groaning on the floor. "Do not insult our champion," the girl shouted, her accent thick with rage. Malfoy, clutching his side, struggled to his feet, but before he could respond, Crabbe and Goyle surged forward, fists clenched, ready to retaliate. The Beauxbatons student wasn't alone for long. Two more students from her school stepped up beside her, wands drawn, and the air crackled with tension. In an instant, chaos erupted. Crab lunged at the Beauxbaton student, fists swinging wildly, while Goyle charged at one of her companions. Spells flew from wands on both sides, curses and hexes lighting up the great hall. A chair flew across the room, hitting the wall with a loud bang. Students shrieked and scrambled out of the way as the fight escalated, with punches, curses, and hexes flying in every direction. "Blimey!" Ron yelped, ducking just as a bolt of green light shot past his ear. "We need to get out of here." Harry, wide-eyed, barely had time to react before Hermione grabbed his arm and yanked him toward the doors. "Come on, let's go before the teachers get here." "Move," Harry urged, pushing through the doors just as the first of the teachers stormed into the room. The days that followed the second task were a whirlwind. The tension between the schools had reached a fever high. Hogwarts was ecstatic, the whole school buzzing with pride at Harry's astonishing victory. Beauxbatons, on the other hand, incensed by the lewd articles about their champion, were a powder keg. Any mention of their champion could risk setting off any one of the delegation. The Durmstrang school proved equally dangerous. While apparently short of new candidates to carry the flag, they seemed more than happy to duel anyone they deemed to question their school spirit. This affected Harry greatly, first of all because it put a very large target on his back, being so far in the lead after two successful tasks versus two non-finishers, and secondly, the inter-school rivalry reaching such a level that he had started to opt using his invisibility cloak to move between classes at times. The fact that he had completed the task in an unbelievable 2 minutes and 32 seconds, rescuing both Hermione and Fleur's sister, Gabrielle, had cemented him as a hero in the eyes of his Hogwarts peers. It also somewhat inoculated him among the Beauxbaton crowd, who, because of Fleur's gratitude, tolerated his existence, at least to a point where they didn't shoot spells after him in the corridors like the Durmstrang sometimes did. Everywhere he went, students either clapped him on the back, shouted his name in the corridors, and treated him like he was already the Triwizard champion, or physically or verbally attacked him. There wasn't much middle ground. The day after the task, a ceremony had been planned for Durmstrang to submit a new champion. But things didn't go as expected. When the goblet was lit during the evening feast, not a single Durmstrang student had volunteered, and thus the goblet only emitted very sad blue sparks. Another ceremony had to be scheduled for the following evening, and another one the day following when the same result came a second evening. Whispers spread like wildfire rumors that Karkaroff had been spotted, furious, storming around the Durmstrang camp, forcing students to throw their names into the goblet. Finally, the goblet spat out a new name. Ivan Ivanovich, a skinny, pale boy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere but there. His selection was met with the weakest applause Harry had ever heard. On the plus side, Harry couldn't remember ever being as full from the 3 consecutive feasts as he was following the Durmstrang debacle. Meanwhile, Fleur Delacour's attention toward Harry had cranked up to an almost unbearable level. Everywhere he went, she seemed to find him, smiling, fluttering her eyelashes, always thanking him for saving Gabrielle, always finding excuses to talk to him. The whole situation really put a terrible strain on his relationship with Hermione, who seemed to find any excuse not to talk to Harry for the whole next day if Fleur even looked his direction. Physics BCH. Author's note: I do have somewhere I'm going with this story, I promise. But for now, I'm just enjoying soap opera. ING it out for a while. Sorry not sorry. The Gryffindor common room was quiet, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. It was late, and the rest of the students had long since gone to bed. Harry and Hermione sat across from each other on the worn-out couches, the flickering firelight casting long shadows around them. Harry had spent the past few minutes trying to explain what had happened to him during the second task, but the words felt clumsy and inadequate. He'd never been good at putting things like this into words. "So, what did you actually do?" Hermione asked, her brow furrowed in that way it always did when she was deep in thought. Harry stared down at his hands, turning them over as if the answer would somehow materialize in his palms. "I don't really know, I guess. I sort of turned the water inside out around me. I wasn't really moving, but it was like everything else shifted. It felt like I got pulled deeper into the lake. Instantly, Hermione's eyes widened slightly as she considered his words. So, you turned everything around you? Almost like apparition. Harry shook his head. I've never operated before, so I don't know. But I didn't move. But just like all of a sudden, everything was pitch black and my ears hurt like hell. It was like an explosion inside my head. The pressure was so bad. I have honestly no idea how to explain it better. Hermione nodded, chewing on her bottom lip thoughtfully. Well, the theory behind apparition is that you turn on the spot, and that somehow displaces you to a new location. But from what you're describing, it wasn't you turning. It was everything else around you that shifted. Yeah, Harry agreed. I didn't feel like I was doing the moving. It's hard to explain. Hermione looked away for a moment, clearly considering the implications of this. I didn't think it was apparition either, because, well, it's impossible to apparate on school grounds. But this sounds like something similar. She paused, then looked at Harry with a spark of curiosity. Do you think you could try it now? Just to see if you could do whatever you did again? Maybe move to the other side of the common room? Or something? Harry still here. I don't know. I don't even know how I did it. I was just trying to save the hostages, well, you. Hermione blushed a bit, but she didn't back down. Well, maybe you could try to recreate it. Just focus on turning things around you, like you said. You're in a safe place. Nothing's trying to drown you this time. Harry hesitated, then nodded. It'd probably be easier if someone were. He closed his eyes, trying to remember the sensation from under the lake. The feeling of the world collapsing around him, of the water folding in on itself. He visualized the common room in front of him, the sofa across the room, the thin air between him and it. He tried to imagine what it would be like if he could look behind the air, if he could peel it back like a curtain and see what was hiding on the other side. Minutes passed in silence, and Harry kept concentrating, his breath slow and deliberate. Hermione sat quietly across from him, her eyes never leaving his face. There was an intensity in the air, like they were both waiting for anything to happen. He opened his eyes slowly, trying hard to concentrate on the feeling of that intensity. The space in front of him seemed to bend, like a mirror turning without edges. His heart pounded in his chest as he focused on it. And before he could even process what was happening, he was staring at himself from across the room. Harry blinked, his mind racing as he tried to grasp the impossible. It was like looking into a reflection. He could see himself and Hermione sitting on the couch, but from the other side of the room. I gotta try something, he muttered. Carefully, he grabbed a pillow from beside him and, still concentrating on the strange tear in space, threw it toward the mirror-like distortion. Hermione gasped softly, her hand covering her mouth. Harry watched in disbelief as the common room flickered and the pillow sailed towards them. But not in one piece. Half of the pillow landed in front of him with a soft thud, feathers spilling out in a slow drift. The other half was still falling from across the room, cut cleanly in two by the moment the rift had closed. Harry turned his head slowly to look at Hermione, who was staring wide-eyed at the half pillow in front of them. Her mouth opened and closed as she tried to find the words. You just... Hermione whispered, her voice trembling with awe. Harry, I think you just broke the laws of magic or something. Harry looked down at the feathers gently floating to the ground, his heart pulsing so loud in his ears he actually might turn deaf. He had no idea what he'd just done, or something indeed. When Harry and Hermione finally told Ron about what had happened in the common room, they were met with a reaction that neither of them had expected. Ron blinked at them both, his expression somewhere between disbelief and mild amusement. Right, he said slowly, scratching the back of his head. So, you're telling me you folded space or something and threw a pillow across the room, and it got cut in half? Harry nodded, his brow furrowed with frustration. Yes. It was like the air just shifted, and then the pillow, well, split. Ron raised an eyebrow. Aha! Hermione leaned forward, her eyes wide with excitement. We're serious, Ron? It happened. It's not like any magic we've ever seen before. It could be something completely new. Ron snorted softly, though not unkindly. You sure it wasn't just a trick of the light? I mean, mate, we've all been through a lot lately. Maybe it's, stress? Harry shot him a look, but Ron held up his hands in mock surrender. All right. I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. Let's see this folding space thing. A short while later, the three of them stood in an abandoned classroom. Harry and Hermione huddled together near a dusty old desk, while Ron leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, watching them with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "Go on, then," Ron said, giving Harry a half-smile. "Show me how it works." Harry exchanged a glance with Hermione, feeling a flicker of uncertainty. He hadn't been sure how he'd done it the first time, and the idea of trying to replicate it under Ron's watchful eye only added to the pressure. Still, he nodded and took a deep breath, focusing his mind on the space in front of him. He closed his eyes, trying to summon the same sensation he'd felt the night before, the feeling of the air bending, of reality itself twisting around him. He visualized the room folding inward the same way it had in the common room, and tried to pull the edges of the space around him like turning a mirror. Minutes passed, but nothing happened. Beside him, Hermione watched in quiet concentration, but the anticipation in the air slowly began to fizzle. Harry opened his eyes again, frustration gnawing at his insides. The classroom looked exactly the same, no ripples in the air, no bending space. Just the same dusty room. Ron let out a small sigh, looking almost relieved. "You sure you're not just tired, mate? Or maybe you ate something weird at dinner?" Harry groaned, running a hand through his messy hair. "I know what I did, Ron. I can't seem to do it again." Ron pushed off from the wall and stretched. "Look, I'm not saying you didn't do something, but..." He glanced between them. "I'm not exactly subscribing to this whole transcendental meditation stuff. My mom tried to get me into it once, said it'd help me relax my spirit." He shook his head. "Didn't work then, and I doubt it's going to work now." Hermione pursed her lips, looking mildly irritated. "It's not meditation, Ron. Well, we don't really know what it is. But it's magic. I'm sure of it." Ron shrugged. "Maybe. But whatever it is, I think you might need more than a dusty classroom to figure it out." He gave Harry a pat on the back. "Look, I've got to head to Charms. You two can keep at it if you like, but I think I'll leave the mind-bending magic experiments to you two." With that, he grabbed his bag and sauntered off, leaving Harry and Hermione standing alone in the empty room. Harry sighed, sitting down on one of the old wooden chairs. Maybe he's right. Maybe it was just a fluke. Hermione, who had been pacing slightly, stopped and shook her head. "No, Harry, it wasn't a fluke. You did something incredible. We need to figure out how." They spent the next 20 minutes trying everything, Harry focusing as hard as he could, Hermione suggesting different ways to think about the problem. They even switched spots, tried different objects, different angles. But no matter what they did, the room stayed stubbornly still, no sign of the strange bending space from the night before. Frustration began to mount. Harry's head throbbed from concentrating so hard, and even Hermione, ever the optimist, was starting to look a little disheartened. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Harry slumped back in the chair. "I don't think I can do it again." Hermione sat down across from him, biting her lip. "You will do it again, Harry. You just need to figure out what triggered it in the first place. We'll keep working on it." Harry nodded, but doubt gnawed at him. What if it had been a one-time thing? What if he could never do it again? The bell rang in the distance, signaling the start of the next class, and Hermione stood up, giving Harry an encouraging look. "Come on, we'll figure it out. But right now, we'd better get to Charms before Professor Flitwick thinks folds our grades and makes them disappear." Harry chuckled, grabbing his bag as they left the classroom. At Charms, Professor Flitwick, immediately after they filed in and found their seats, started talking animatedly about the theory behind banishing charms. His small form nearly hidden behind a stack of books he was using to prop himself up. Harry slouched in his seat and quickly stopped paying attention, his mind wandering back to the strange incident in the common room. Harry had been sat a few seats away from Ron, who had arrived earlier, in one row behind him. He found himself again trying to replicate what had happened in the common room the other night. He imagined it just like before, the air bending, folding in on itself. He narrowed his eyes, focusing on the back of Ron's head, trying to recreate that same shift. For a split second, nothing happened. And then, the familiar sensation returned. The rimless mirror twisted inward, folding space around itself. Harry's heart jumped in his chest as, suddenly, He found himself looking straight into Ron's eyes from the other side. Ron's startled face stared back at him, wide-eyed. Then, with a loud yelp, Ron jerked back in his seat, nearly toppling out of his chair. "Bloody hell!" Ron gasped. The fold in the air silently snapped shut. Harry blinked, suddenly back to staring at the back of Ron's head again. The entire class turned to look at Ron, who was still breathing heavily, his face flushed with shock. Flitwick, who had been in the middle of explaining a particularly tricky bit of wand movement, stopped mid-sentence, his tiny hands perched on the edge of his podium. He raised an eyebrow, clearly irritated by the interruption. Ron, still shaken, turned back to Harry with a wild look in his eyes. I just he stammered, struggling to find the right words. "Mr. Weasley, if you've finished your theatrics," Flitwick said, his squeaky voice dripping with impatience, "perhaps you'd like to demonstrate the banishing charm for the class, seeing as you seem to find today's lesson so exciting." Ron paled, his gaze darting from Flitwick to Harry, and then to the rest of the class, who were all watching him intently. "All right," he mumbled, standing up slowly. Flitwick flicked his wand, sending a small cushion into the air in front of Ron. "Banishing charm, if you please, Mr. Weasley." Ron gripped his wand, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. He muttered the incantation, "Depulso," but nothing happened. The cushion remained hovering in the air, completely unmoved. "Then maybe stop the antics and focus, if you please." His tone was sharp, but not unkind. He waved his own wand, effortlessly sending the cushion flying across the room. Ron turned to face Harry, his expression a mix of confusion and accusation. "Mate," he whispered, "what the hell was that?" Chapter 11. Author's note: I do have somewhere I'm going with this story, I promise. But for now, I'm just enjoying soap opera. ING it out for a while. Sorry not sorry. The Gryffindor common room was quiet, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. It was late, and the rest of the students had long since gone to bed. Harry and Hermione sat across from each other on the worn-out couches, the flickering firelight casting long shadows around them. Harry had spent the past few minutes trying to explain what had happened to him during the second task, but the words felt clumsy and inadequate. He'd never been good at putting things like this into words. "So, what did you actually do?" Hermione asked, her brow furrowed in that way it always did when she was deep in thought. Harry stared down at his hands, turning them over as if the answer would somehow materialize in his palms. "I don't really know, I guess. I sort of turned the water inside out around me. I wasn't really moving, but it was like everything else shifted. It felt like I got pulled deeper into the lake." Instantly, Hermione's eyes widened slightly as she considered his words. "So, you turned everything around you? Almost like apparition." Harry shook his head. "I've never operated before, so I don't know. But I didn't move. But just like all of a sudden, everything was pitch black, and my ears hurt like hell. It was like an explosion inside my head, the pressure was so bad. I have honestly no idea how to explain it better." Hermione nodded, chewing on her bottom lip thoughtfully. "Well, the theory behind apparition is that you turn on the spot, and that somehow displaces you to a new location. But from what you're describing, it wasn't you turning. It was everything else around you that shifted." "Yeah," Harry agreed. "I didn't feel like I was doing the moving. It's hard to explain." Hermione looked away for a moment, clearly considering the implications of this. "I didn't think it was apparition either because, well, it's impossible to apparate on school grounds. But this sounds like something similar." She paused, then looked at Harry with a spark of curiosity. "Do you think you could try it now? Just to see if you can do whatever you did again? Maybe move to the other side of the common room or something?" Harry stared at her. "I don't know. I don't even know how I did it. I was just trying to save the hostages, well, you." Hermione blushed a bit, but she didn't back down. "Well, maybe you can try to recreate it. Just focus on turning things around you, like you said. You're in a safe place. Nothing's trying to drown you this time." Harry hesitated, then nodded. It'd probably be easier if someone were. He closed his eyes, trying to remember the sensation from under the lake. The feeling of the world collapsing around him, of the water folding in on itself. He visualized the common room in front of him, the sofa across the room, the thin air between him and it. He tried to imagine what it would be like if he could look behind the air, if he could peel it back like a curtain, and see what was hiding on the other side. Minutes passed in silence, and Harry kept concentrating, his breath slow and deliberate. Hermione sat quietly across from him, her eyes never leaving his face. There was an intensity in the air, like they were both waiting for anything to happen. He opened his eyes slowly, trying hard to concentrate on the feeling of that intensity. The space in front of him seemed to bend, like a mirror turning without edges. His heart pounded in his chest as he focused on it. And before he could even process what was happening, he was staring at himself from across the room. Harry blinked, his mind racing as he tried to grasp the impossible. It was like looking into a reflection. He could see himself and Hermione sitting on the couch, but from the other side of the room. "I gotta try something," he muttered. Carefully, he grabbed a pillow from beside him and, still concentrating on the strange tear in space, threw it toward the mirror-like distortion. Hermione gasped softly, her hand covering her mouth. Harry watched in disbelief as the common room flickered and the pillow sailed towards them. But not in one piece. Half of the pillow landed in front of him with a soft thud, feathers spilling out in a slow drift. The other half was still falling from across the room, cut cleanly in two by the moment the rift had closed. Harry turned his head slowly to look at Hermione, who was staring wide-eyed at the half pillow in front of them. Her mouth opened and closed as she tried to find the words. "You just—" Hermione whispered, her voice trembling with awe. "Harry, I think you just broke the laws of magic or something." Harry looked down at the feathers gently floating to the ground, his heart pulsing so loud in his ears he actually might turn deaf. He had no idea what he'd just done, or something indeed, when Harry and Hermione finally told Ron about what had happened in the common room. They were met with a reaction that neither of them had expected. Ron blinked at them both, his expression somewhere between disbelief and mild amusement. "Right," he said slowly, scratching the back of his head. "So, you're telling me you folded space or something and threw a pillow across the room, and it got cut in half?" Harry nodded, his brow furrowed with frustration. "Yes." It was like the air just shifted, and then the pillow, well, split. Ron raised an eyebrow. "Aha!" Hermione leaned forward, her eyes wide with excitement. "We're serious, Ron? It happened. It's not like any magic we've ever seen before. It could be something completely new." Ron snorted softly, though not unkindly. "You sure it wasn't just a trick of the light? I mean, mate, we've all been through a lot lately. Maybe it's, stress?" Harry shot him a look, but Ron held up his hands in mock surrender. All right. I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. Let's see this folding space thing." A short while later, the three of them stood in an abandoned classroom, Harry and Hermione huddled together near a dusty old desk, while Ron leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, watching them with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. "Go on, then," Ron said, giving Harry a half-smile. "Show me how it works." Harry exchanged a glance with Hermione, feeling a flicker of uncertainty. He hadn't been sure how he'd done it the first time, and the idea of trying to replicate it under Ron's watchful eye only added to the pressure. Still, he nodded and took a deep breath, focusing his mind on the space in front of him. He closed his eyes, trying to summon the same sensation he'd felt the night before, the feeling of the air bending, of reality itself twisting around him. He visualized the room folding inward the same way it had in the common room, and tried to pull the edges of the space around him like turning a mirror. Minutes passed, but nothing happened. Beside him, Hermione watched in quiet concentration, but the anticipation in the air slowly began to fizzle. Harry opened his eyes again, frustration gnawing at his insides. The classroom looked exactly the same, no ripples in the air, no bending space. Just the same dusty room. Ron let out a small sigh, looking almost relieved. "You sure you're not just tired, mate? Or maybe you ate something weird at dinner?" Harry groaned, running a hand through his messy hair. "I know what I did, Ron. I can't seem to do it again." Ron pushed off from the wall and stretched. "Look, I'm not saying you didn't do something, but..." He glanced between them. "I'm not exactly subscribing to this whole transcendental meditation stuff. My mom tried to get me into it once. Said it'd help me relax my spirit." He shook his head. "Didn't work then, and I doubt it's going to work now." Hermione pursed her lips, looking mildly irritated. It's not meditation, Ron. It's, well, we don't really know what it is. But it's magic. I'm sure of it. Ron shrugged. Maybe. But whatever it is, I think you might need more than a dusty classroom to figure it out. He gave Harry a pat on the back. Look, I got a head of charms. You two can keep at it if you like, but I think I'll leave the mind-bending magic experiments to you two. With that, he grabbed his bag and sauntered off, leaving Harry and Hermione standing alone in the empty room. Harry sighed, sitting down on one of the old wooden chairs. Maybe he's right. Maybe it was just a fluke. Hermione, who had been pacing slightly, stopped and shook her head. No, Harry, it wasn't a fluke. You did something incredible. We need to figure out how. They spent the next 20 minutes trying everything, Harry focusing as hard as he could, Hermione suggesting different ways to think about the problem. They even switched spots, tried different objects, different angles. But no matter what they did, the room stayed stubbornly still, no sign of the strange bending space from the night before. Frustration began to mount. Harry's head throbbed from concentrating so hard, and even Hermione, ever the optimist, was starting to look a little disheartened. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Harry slumped back in the chair. I don't think I can do it again. Hermione sat down across from him, biting her lip. You will do it again, Harry. You just need to figure out what triggered it in the first place. We'll keep working on it. Harry nodded, but doubt gnawed at him. What if it had been a one-time thing? What if he could never do it again? The bell rang in the distance, signaling the start of the next class, and Hermione stood up, giving Harry an encouraging look. Come on, we'll figure it out. But right now, we'd better get to charms before Professor Flitwick thinks folds our grades and makes them disappear. Harry chuckled, grabbing his bag as they left the classroom. At charms, Professor Flitwick, immediately after they filed in and found their seats, started talking animatedly about the theory behind banishing charms. His small form nearly hidden behind a stack of books he was using to prop himself up. Harry slouched in his seat and quickly stopped paying attention, his mind wandering back to the strange incident in the common room. Harry had been sat a few seats away from Ron, who had arrived earlier, and one row behind him. He found himself again trying to replicate what had happened in the common room the other night. He imagined it just like before, the air bending, folding in on itself. He narrowed his eyes, focusing on the back of Ron's head, trying to recreate that same shift. For a split second, nothing happened. And then, the familiar sensation returned. The rimless mirror twisted inward, folding space around itself. Harry's heart jumped in his chest as, suddenly, he found himself looking straight into Ron's eyes from the other side. Ron's startled face stared back at him, wide-eyed. Then, with a loud yelp, Ron jerked back in his seat, nearly toppling out of his chair. Bloody hell! Ron gasped. The fold in the air silently snapped shut. Harry blinked, suddenly back to staring at the back of Ron's head again. The entire class turned to look at Ron, who was still breathing heavily, his face flushed with shock. Flitwick, who had been in the middle of explaining a particularly tricky bit of wand movement, stopped mid-sentence, his tiny hands perched on the edge of his podium. He raised an eyebrow, clearly irritated by the interruption. Ron, still shaken, turned back to Harry with a wild look in his eyes. I just he stammered, struggling to find the right words. Mr. Weasley, if you've finished your theatrics, Flitwick said, his squeaky voice dripping with impatience, perhaps you'd like to demonstrate the banishing charm for the class, seeing as you seem to find today's lesson so exciting. Ron paled, his gaze darting from Flitwick to Harry, and then to the rest of the class, who were all watching him intently. All right, he mumbled, standing up slowly. Flitwick flicked his wand, sending a small cushion into the air in front of Ron. Banishing charm, if you please, Mr. Weasley. Ron gripped his wand, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. He muttered the incantation, Depulso, but nothing happened. The cushion remained hovering in the air, completely unmoved. Then maybe stop the antics and focus, if you please. His tone was sharp but not unkind. He waved his own wand, effortlessly sending the cushion flying across the room. Ron turned to face Harry, his expression a mix of confusion and accusation. Mate, he whispered. What the hell was that? Harry shrugged his shoulders in amusement. Ron looked from Harry to over his head with sort of a stunned look. In fact, Flitwick stopped mid-sentence. Harry looked behind himself at the classroom door, blinking in surprise as Professor Dumbledore stepped into the room. There was a moment of stunned silence across the entire class. The headmaster rarely interrupted classes in person. "Excuse me, Professor Flitwick," Dumbledore said, his voice calm but with an undercurrent of urgency. "I need to borrow Mr. Potter for a short while." Flitwick, looking surprised but not questioning, nodded immediately. "Of course, Headmaster. Potter, off you go." Harry's stomach dropped. He glanced at Ron and Hermione, who both gave him puzzled, worried looks before quickly gathering his things and standing up. Dumbledore didn't say another word as Harry joined him. Without waiting for an explanation, Dumbledore turned on his heel and set off down the corridor, walking briskly. Harry had to half-jog to keep up, the sound of his shoes echoing in the otherwise empty hallways. He stole a glance at Dumbledore, wondering if he should ask what was going on, but the headmaster's expression was unreadable, and Harry didn't dare interrupt. They moved quickly through the castle, past students, up staircases, and through long, twisting corridors, until they finally reached the familiar stone gargoyle that guarded the entrance to Dumbledore's office. "Cockroach cluster," Dumbledore murmured, and the gargoyle sprang aside, revealing the spiral staircase that led to the headmaster's study. Without another word, Dumbledore ascended, Harry following closely behind. The tension in the air was palpable, and Harry's curiosity mixed with growing apprehension. Dumbledore's unusually fast pace, the lack of explanation, it all made Harry's mind race with possibilities. When they entered the study, Harry's eyes immediately went to the figure standing by the fire. His heart leapt into his throat. "Sirius!" Harry exclaimed, rushing forward. Sirius Black turned from the fire, a smile spreading across his thin, weathered face as he opened his arms to greet Harry. "Harry," he said, his voice rough but filled with warmth. "Good to see you." Before Harry could ask what was going on, Dumbledore cleared his throat, stepping toward his desk. "I apologize for the sudden nature of this meeting," he said, glancing between Harry and Sirius. "But given the complexity of the situation, I felt it was necessary to make an exception." Harry looked between Dumbledore and Sirius, his curiosity now burning. "What's going on?" Sirius exchanged a glance with Dumbledore, then gestured for Harry to sit. "There's things you need to know, Harry," Sirius said, his tone serious now, his earlier warmth tempered with concern. "I've promised in exchange for being allowed to be here that I would not speak until Dumbledore is finished." Harry nodded slowly, and then Dumbledore's study grew quieter still. The hum of the silver instruments, the only sound as the weight of the conversation loomed. It was then that Dumbledore began, as if he were picking up from an earlier point. "The imposter is dead," he said, his voice calm but heavy. The warm light of Dumbledore's office cast long shadows across the walls, reflecting off the many delicate silver instruments that hummed and clicked softly on the shelves. Fawkes sat perched in the corner, preening his scarlet feathers, while the soft rustle of parchment seemed to blend with the quiet, familiar ticking of the various instruments. Dumbledore's eyes, usually so warm and twinkling, seemed to grow a touch cooler as he leaned back in his chair. "It was Barty Crouch Jr., he said simply, his voice calm but with an edge of impatience. "The son of Bartemius Crouch." Harry's eyes widened in shock. "What? But I thought, didn't his father, wasn't he supposed to be dead?" Harry looked from Sirius to Dumbledore. Sirius was mostly rigid, but gave a brief nod. Dumbledore continued. "Yes, his father wanted us to believe he was dead. But as I am sure you have already learned, Harry, many things are not as they seem in our world." Harry opened his mouth to ask more, but Dumbledore's slightly impatient air made him hesitate. He wanted to know how Barty Crouch Jr. had managed to stay hidden, how he had fooled everyone. But something told him that now wasn't the time to press the matter. Instead, Harry shifted in his seat and asked the question that had been nagging at him for days. Why did the imposter Barty Crouch Jr. want me in the Triwizard tournament? What was the point? There was a long pause. Dumbledore's fingers tapped lightly on the arm of his chair, the quiet rhythm mixing with the background hum of the office. The silence stretched on, the air thick with unspoken tension. Finally, Dumbledore broke the silence, his voice quiet and deliberate. "He was sent here to kidnap you," Dumbledore said, his clear blue eyes boring into Harry's. His goal was to bring you to Voldemort for a blood ritual. Harry felt his stomach twist. A blood ritual? Yes, Dumbledore continued, his tone measured. The purpose was to steal your blood, Harry. Voldemort intended to use it in a ritual to restore his body. Harry's mouth went dry. That's, he sputtered, his heart racing. The idea that Voldemort would come back, it was horrifying. He stared at Dumbledore, waiting for a reaction, for some sign that this was just as terrible as it sounded. But Dumbledore simply looked at him with an unreadable expression. Sirius was studying the ceiling, avoiding his eyes at all cost, it seemed. Is it outrageous? Dumbledore asked quietly. His blue eyes held an unusual intensity, something deeper than Harry had ever seen before. Is it truly terrible? Harry blinked, taken aback by the question. Of course it is, he exclaimed. Voldemort would he'd come back. He'd be more powerful than ever, right? How could that not be terrible? Dumbledore hesitated, his fingers steepling in front of him as he considered Harry's words. There was a long, uncomfortable silence, filled only by the soft clicking of the silver instruments around the room. Finally, Dumbledore spoke again, his voice strangely casual. It wouldn't be altogether terrible if you were to, let's call it, go along with it. Harry's mind stuttered. What? He said, his voice barely above a whisper. Dumbledore's gaze remained steady, almost as if he were weighing each word before he spoke. If you were to allow Voldemort's ritual to happen willingly, the deep magics involved, the result would be unintended. Harry frowned, his confusion growing by the second. Dumbledore sighed, his shoulders relaxing slightly as he leaned back in his chair. The implications are unclear, but what is known is this. Your role in the ritual is that of the unwilling enemy. Voldemort intends to use your blood, the blood of his greatest foe, to restore his body. Your non-consent is crucial to the magic he intends to use. Dumbledore gave a faint smile. If you were to willingly participate, the ritual's intended purpose would unravel. The magic would lose its potency, its focus. In fact, he paused, his eyes twinkling briefly with a flicker of amusement. It would be rather funny, in a way. Harry stared at him, incredulous. Funny? You think that would be funny? Sirius looked sharply at Dumbledore, but the headmaster continued, his voice calm but deliberate. Perhaps not funny in the traditional sense. But you see, Harry, by willingly offering your blood, you would invert the entire dynamic of the ritual. Instead of taking something from you by force, Voldemort would find himself receiving something that no longer holds the power he seeks. Harry's mind was racing, trying to keep up with the conversation. So, if I just let him do it willingly, then what? Would it weaken him? Dumbledore's face grew more serious. The ritual is designed to reconstruct Voldemort's physical form. There are several parts to it. His corporeal reconstitution requires bones, flesh, and blood, and some terribly complicated enchantments, potions, and certain celestial conditions needs to align. The bones of his father form the foundation. The life force of a servant fuels his existence. And your blood, the blood of his enemy, essentially fills his veins with magic. Harry's eyes widened as he pieced it together. So, if I went along with it, the blood portion would what? Dumbledore's eyes gleamed with a hint of amusement. Perhaps, he said with a slight shrug. This is deep waters, but it's likely Voldemort would be reborn a squib. But something still didn't sit right with him. Dumbledore was being unusually nonchalant about the whole thing, as if the stakes weren't as high as Harry had thought. Was it really that simple? The room fell into a heavy silence again. The clicks and hum of the office, the only sound as Harry tried to process everything. Dumbledore's expression shifted as Harry's question hung in the air. The slight amusement in his eyes faded, replaced by a more contemplative look, as if he were weighing the gravity of the conversation. He folded his hands on the desk and leaned forward, the quiet hum of the office making the pause seem even longer. You see, Harry, Dumbledore began softly, Voldemort wouldn't permanently be a squib if the ritual were to go awry. The issue is more complex than that. Harry frowned. But you said if I went along with it, it could mess up the ritual. That it might make him powerless? Dumbledore gave a slow nod. Yes, it would certainly weaken him. Terribly so. In the body that is reconstructed using your willingly given blood, Voldemort would find himself unable to cast spells. Nothing he could do in that body would restore his magical abilities. Harry blinked, trying to understand. So, he wouldn't be able to cast any spells at all? No magic whatsoever. Wouldn't even be able to brew the simplest potion. Likely even to the point where he is affected by the sort of magic that we use to keep muggles from wandering into Diagon Alley and the likes. Dumbledore confirmed, his blue eyes sharp. But this is an important but, he wouldn't be without options. His body would become a shell, unable to wield magic. However, Voldemort, being the brilliant and twisted mind that he is, would recognize the failure. He would eventually know that his only recourse would be to destroy that body and attempt the ritual again. Essentially, he would be forced to start from scratch. Harry's heart sank a little as he processed that. So, he wouldn't stay powerless forever. No, Dumbledore admitted, his tone measured. But he would be severely weakened, and the next set of celestial conditions necessary for the ritual won't occur for another 10 or 20 years. Harry felt a flicker of hope at that. So, if we just didn't let him do it now, he'd miss his chance, right? Couldn't I just not show up? Then he'd have to wait for another window. Dumbledore sighed softly and shook his head. If only it were that simple, Harry. Voldemort is not lacking for enemies. The ritual, at its core, does not need your blood specifically. What it needs is the blood of an enemy, taken by force. While Voldemort has singled you out as his primary nemesis, the ritual would work with the blood of any enemy. Harry felt his stomach drop. So, if I don't go, he'll just find someone else? Yes, Dumbledore said, his gaze heavy. There are many who oppose Voldemort, and the ritual itself is designed to function using the blood of an unwilling enemy. Voldemort's fixation on you. The boy who lived makes him believe that your blood will grant him a greater power. Harry stared at Dumbledore, and then Sirius, and then back to Dumbledore, his mind racing. So if I refuse to go along with it, and he succeeds in taking my blood by force, he'll come back fully? Dumbledore nodded. Correct. Sirius, leaning forward slowly. And what about afterwards? How's Harry supposed to get out of there once the ritual's done? We can't leave him to fend for himself. Dumbledore turned, regarding Sirius with a calm but calculating expression. There are a number of alternatives, he replied thoughtfully. A prearranged means of escape could be arranged. Sirius cut in, voice sharp with concern. What about operating? Harry could just disapparate as soon as it's done. Dumbledore shook his head. That is not likely without his wand, and we must assume Voldemort will ensure Harry does not have access to it. To expect otherwise would be unwise. Sirius opened his mouth to protest, but Dumbledore continued. A portkey might be more reliable. We could arrange for one to activate after the ritual is complete, or sooner if Harry wishes for it. There must always be an immediate out for him, lest the ritual happen against his will. Sirius, however, was not convinced. What if they find it? What if they dash? He hesitated, glancing at Harry before continuing. What if they remove his clothes and check him? Harry felt a wave of indignation rise in his chest at the thought, but before he could say anything, Dumbledore spoke again, his voice calm. A subcutaneous portkey would be impossible to discover. Harry blinked, frowning. A sub what? Sirius leaned back, considering it. A portkey under the skin, he clarified. They'd never be able to find it. Harry's mind raced. Under the skin? He wasn't sure how he felt about that. That could work, Sirius said, though he still looked uneasy. But Harry wasn't satisfied just yet. What if I just learned to apparate? He asked, turning to face Dumbledore. Couldn't I just learn how to do it myself, in case I need to escape? Just learn to, Sirius muttered. Dumbledore paused, then smiled faintly. Sure, Dumbledore said, after a moment of contemplation, but not from your godfather. Sirius looked crestfallen, his shoulders slumping slightly. Dumbledore's eyes twinkled with the faintest hint of amusement. The escape convict will unfortunately not grace us with his presence for long enough to engage in such affairs. He turned to Harry, his expression softening. There is no harm in skill acquisition, Harry. Learning to apparate could be useful. Harry's heart lifted slightly. When can I start? He asked, eager to have something, anything, that gave him control over his own fate. Dumbledore glanced at his schedule, then nodded to himself. I believe Professor Snape may have time this coming weekend to teach you. Harry's excitement faltered. Snape? The thought of spending hours with Snape, learning something as complex as apparition, drained away any enthusiasm he'd had. Sirius stiffened beside him. I don't want Harry learning from Snape. Harry didn't want that either. Is there anyone else? He asked almost desperately. Dumbledore gave them both a calm but final look. It's the final offer, Harry. Professor Snape is more than qualified to teach you, and there is no time to seek out another instructor. Harry exchanged a glance with Sirius, both of them clearly unhappy with the arrangement. But there was no way around it. With a sigh, Harry finally nodded. All right, I'll learn from Snape. Sirius, clearly still displeased, muttered something under his breath, but eventually gave a reluctant nod as well. Dumbledore's expression softened. Very well, then. You'll begin this weekend. Chapter 12. Professor McGonagall came striding down the length of the Gryffindor table. Potter, she said briskly, her voice carrying easily over the low hum of chatter in the Great Hall. The champions are congregating in the chamber off the hall after breakfast. The champions' families are invited to watch the final task. She barely paused before moving on, her heels clicking sharply on the stone floor as she swept away toward the teacher's table. Harry gaped after her, his fork halfway to his mouth, before setting it down slowly. She doesn't expect the Dursleys to turn up, does she? He asked Ron, completely baffled. Ron snorted into his juice. I'd pay to see that. Harry grimaced. Yeah, that's not happening, though to be honest, I wouldn't mind having Dud here, he muttered, shaking his head. Hermione frowned, glancing over at Harry with a thoughtful expression. Maybe they'll surprise you. Harry let out a humorless laugh. Expecting nothing, Harry walked across the Great Hall and entered the chamber off to the side. He hadn't allowed himself to hope for much, but a small part of him still dreaded the idea of being the only champion without someone there to support him. Inside the chamber, he immediately spotted the new Durmstrang champion, Ivan Ivanovich, standing utterly alone in a corner, his face blank and pale. At least Harry wouldn't be the only unsupported champion, he thought. On the opposite side, Fleur stood with her family. She was chattering away rapidly in French to her mother, who was watching her with a fond, if tired, smile. Fleur's little sister, Gabrielle, was clutching their mother's hand. When Gabrielle spotted Harry, her face lit up, and she waved at him excitedly. Harry grinned, waving back. He was about to turn away when he noticed Mrs. Weasley and Bill standing by the entrance, beaming at him. Relief washed over him, and a warm feeling spread through his chest. As he headed over, he couldn't help but notice Fleur glancing over at them, though she quickly returned to her conversation with her mother. Harry smirked a little, satisfied, but forced himself to focus on Mrs. Weasley and Bill instead. This is really nice of you, Harry muttered to Mrs. Weasley as he reached them, feeling suddenly shy. I thought for a moment, well, I was worried the Dursleys might show up. Oh, don't be daft, Harry, Mrs. Weasley said briskly, pulling him into a tight hug. You know we'd never let you go through this without us. The Dursleys wouldn't know what they were missing anyway. Bill clapped him on the shoulder with a grin. How about showing us around? Haven't been here in years. Harry eagerly agreed, grateful for the distraction. Together, they left the chamber and began walking through the castle. Bill was full of questions about the changes at Hogwarts since he'd left, and Mrs. Weasley listened with pride as Harry described the tournament so far, though he carefully left out any mentions of how dangerous it had been. Not that she hadn't pieced that together herself, especially given how the tournament had already claimed 2 lives so far. As they passed through a quiet corridor, the Minister of Magic, Cornelius Fudge, strode past them, looking hurried and distracted. He gave Harry a polite nod and said, "Ah, Potter, good luck for this evening," before continuing on his way without waiting for a reply. Mrs. Weasley raised an eyebrow. My, the minister himself," she muttered. "This tournament must be quite a big deal if he's here already and the third task isn't even until tonight." "Yeah, must be," Harry said, watching Fudge disappear around the corner. They took a stroll around the grounds after that, and for the first time in days, Harry felt like he could relax. Bill kept the conversation light, pointing out hidden passages and forgotten parts of the grounds from his Hogwarts days. It was a welcome distraction from the mounting pressure of the evening ahead. Eventually, they returned to the castle for lunch. As they made their way to the Gryffindor table, they were joined by Ron and Ginny, both looking surprised to see them. "Blimey, Mom," Ron said, sitting down next to them. "What are you doing here?" Bill grinned at his younger brother. "Oh, we've decided to re-enroll. Figured we'd give Hogwarts another go." Ron snorted, shaking his head. "Yeah, right." Soon enough, Fred and George joined them, along with Ginny, and before Harry knew it, they were all sitting together, laughing and chatting like they were back at the Burrow. For the first time in a while, Harry felt like he could breathe. The looming threat of the third task faded into the background, and he was able to enjoy the company of the people he cared about. He even forgot, for a time, that Fleur had been avoiding him. Halfway through lunch, Hermione arrived, sliding into the seat beside Ron. "You've all started without me," she said, but her smile was warm as she glanced around at them. The afternoon passed in a blissful blur. Harry, Bill, and Mrs. Weasley spent more time walking around the castle, laughing about old stories, and before Harry knew it, the sun was setting, and it was time to return to the Great Hall for the evening feast. Ludo Bagman and Cornelius Fudge had joined the staff at the head table, Bagman looking his usual cheerful self, while Fudge sat beside Madame Maxime, his expression stern and his arms crossed. He didn't speak much, and it was clear that whatever business had brought him to Hogwarts was weighing heavily on his mind. As they sat down to eat, the tension of the evening began creeping back into Harry's thoughts. The final task was only hours away now, and the excitement in the hall was palpable. But for now, surrounded by his friends and the Weasleys, Harry allowed himself a brief moment of peace. The Great Hall was filled with more courses than usual, but Harry could barely touch his food. His nerves were starting to get the better of him, his stomach twisting uncomfortably as the minutes ticked by. The enchanted ceiling overhead began to fade from a vibrant blue to a dusky purple as dusk approached, the colors deepening along with the growing tension in his chest. At the staff table, Dumbledore rose to his feet, and the hall fell silent. His presence commanded instant attention, the kind that made Harry's pulse quicken even more. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dumbledore's voice rang out, calm but carrying a weight of importance. "In 5 minutes' time, I will be asking you to make your way down to the Quidditch field for the third and final task of the Triwizard Tournament. Will the champions please follow Mr. Bagman down to the stadium now?" A round of applause erupted throughout the hall. Harry, along with Fleur and the Durmstrang champion, rose from their seats, and the Gryffindor table in particular cheered for him loudly. His legs felt like they were made of lead as he walked toward the doors, Bagman leading the way. Ron and Hermione gave him encouraging smiles from the table, but Harry could barely muster a smile back. As they left the Great Hall and began walking toward the Quidditch pitch, Fleur's hand grazed Harry's several times. The contact sent a jolt through him, and though neither of them said anything, the brief touch made his pulse quicken even more. He glanced sideways at her, but her face remained set, focused. The closer they got to the pitch, the darker the sky became, casting long shadows across the castle grounds. When they finally stepped onto the Quidditch field, Harry barely recognized it. The familiar stadium was now transformed, dominated by towering, 20-foot high hedges that ran all the way around the perimeter of the field. In front of them loomed a narrow gap, the entrance to the vast maze. The passage beyond it was dark and foreboding, the faint rustle of leaves carried by the wind, and Harry's stomach flipped again. 5 minutes later, the stands were filling quickly. The rumble of feet and excited voices echoed across the field as hundreds of students filed into their seats, the air buzzing with anticipation. Harry could hear the murmurs and chatter from the stands, his name mentioned more than once, but he blocked it out, his eyes fixed on the entrance to the maze. As Harry stood at the edge of the maze, gripping his wand tightly, his eyes scanned the growing crowd of spectators. Among them, he saw familiar faces: Dumbledore, Madame Maxime towering above the others, and a Bulgarian teacher he didn't recognize standing somewhat apart from the rest. Crouch was there, looking pale and tired, but Karkaroff was nowhere to be seen. Harry thought that was strange. For a headmaster, especially one so protective of his school's reputation, Karkaroff's absence felt glaring. Then, joining the group of judges, Fudge appeared, accompanied by a very short, middle-aged woman with a toad-like face. There was a strange mood lingering over the evening, something Harry couldn't quite place. This was it, the final task. He gripped his wand tighter, trying to steady his nerves. Fleur was standing close by, her expression unreadable, and the third champion was off to the side, pacing slightly. Bagman clapped his hands together, beaming as he walked over to join the champions. "Ready, then?" Bagman asked, clapping Harry on the shoulder. Harry swallowed hard. "As ready as I'll ever be," he thought. "Right, champions?" Bagman called. "Before we get started, let's go over the rules once again. The maze is full of obstacles, magical creatures, enchantments, and various other surprises. If at any point you feel you cannot continue, or if you're in danger, you are to send up red sparks. The marshals will be stationed around the maze to help you, should you need it. We'll come right to you." He demonstrated by pointing his wand skyward and casting a simple spell. Red sparks shot up from his wand, exploding in the air above them like fireworks. Right then, Bagman continued, turning to the three champions. "Each of you, give it a go. Let's make sure you can call for help if needed." Fleur, standing tall and composed, went first. With a graceful flick of her wand, red sparks burst into the air effortlessly. She gave a small, satisfied nod. Harry followed, his hand steady despite the tension in his chest. Red sparks flared from his wand, crackling in the darkening sky. He let out a breath, relieved that it worked without issue. Then it was Ivan's turn. The new Durmstrang champion, pale and jittery, raised his wand awkwardly. He cast a spell, but nothing happened. His brow furrowed, and he tried again, but the air remained clear. Bagman's cheerful demeanor faltered for a moment. He stepped closer to Ivan with a look of concern. "You sure you're up for this, lad?" Bagman asked kindly. "If you can't manage the red sparks, it might be a good idea to withdraw. No shame in it." Ivan shook his head, his lips pressed into a tight line. "No, I'll compete," he said, his voice low and determined. Bagman glanced at him, then sighed, muttering under his breath, "It's your funeral." Harry caught the words and frowned, thinking that was a bit harsh. Ivan clearly wasn't as confident as Crumb had been, but to dismiss him like that felt cold. Still, no one else commented. The mood remained tense as Bagman stepped back to address the judges, leaving the champions to ready themselves at the entrance of the maze. The crowd in the stands was buzzing with anticipation, but the strange sense of unease lingered in Harry's mind. Something about the evening felt off. He couldn't shake the feeling that this task would be different from the others, not just because it was the final one, but because there was something darker at play. The maze loomed before them, its towering hedges casting long shadows across the field. The entrance yawned open like a mouth waiting to swallow them whole. Bagman pointed his wand at his throat, muttering, "Sonorous," and his voice amplified through the stadium, booming over the heads of the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, the third and final task of the Triwizard tournament is about to begin," he announced, his voice echoing through the darkening sky. Excitement buzzed through the stands, eager murmurs spreading like wildfire. "Let me remind you how the points currently stand," Bagman continued, his tone upbeat, as though this was just another Quidditch match and not a life-threatening tournament. In first place, with an incredible 96 points, Mr. Harry Potter of Hogwarts School. The roar of cheers and applause that erupted made Harry's ears ring. The sound swelled as it spread across the stadium, so loud that it sent birds from the Forbidden Forest fluttering into the twilight sky. Harry glanced up, his stomach twisting as he acknowledged the attention, his nerves tightening with every cheer. In second place, with 8 points, Miss Fleur Delacour of Beauxbatons Academy. Bagman continued, as another round of applause followed, this time more polite, though still enthusiastic. Fleur stood tall beside him, her chin raised as she acknowledged the cheers with a gracious nod. Harry noticed, with some satisfaction, that a few of her supporters were giving her admiring glances. It was no secret that she hadn't performed as well as expected, but she carried herself with pride nonetheless. Bagman's voice echoed again, though this time it had a slight hesitation. "And in third place, Mr." He faltered, glancing over at Ivan, who stood rigid and pale beside them. Leaning slightly toward the Durmstrang champion, Bagman whispered, though the amplified sonorous spell still carried his voice just as loudly. "Sorry, kid, your name is? Hard to keep track of you all." A ripple of awkward laughter spread through the crowd as Ivan mumbled something under his breath, his face flushing red with embarrassment. "Mr. Ivan Ivanovich with, well, 0 points," Bagman announced, completely unfazed by the boy's indignation, his voice almost gleeful as the final tally was revealed. Harry felt a wave of discomfort at how easily Bagman had humiliated Ivan. The poor boy had been thrown into the tournament after Crumb's death, and now, standing in front of a crowd of strangers, he had to endure this public shaming. Harry glanced at Ivan, whose jaw was clenched tight, staring at the ground, looking as though he wished it would swallow him whole. Bagman didn't seem to notice or care, and Harry couldn't help but think that the former Quidditch commentator rather enjoyed humiliating the third Durmstrang champion a bit. With a final cheer from the crowd, Bagman gestured toward the maze, the towering hedges swaying slightly in the evening breeze. "Now, champions, prepare yourselves for the third and final task. You'll enter the maze in the order of your current standings. Mr. Potter, you'll lead the way, followed by Miss Delacour, and then Mr. Ivanovich. Remember, the goal is to reach the Triwizard Cup at the center of the maze." Harry nodded, his heart hammering in his chest. The entrance to the maze loomed before them, dark and foreboding, and for a moment, the noise of the crowd faded into the background. He could feel Fleur standing beside him, poised and ready, while Ivan remained stiff and silent. The maze felt like a living thing, waiting for them to step inside. "Good luck," Bagman called out, his voice filled with forced enthusiasm. "Let the final task begin." A plan poorly construed. The moment Harry stepped into the maze, the roar of the crowd faded away, swallowed by the towering hedges that loomed around him. The cheers and claps from the stands were replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves in the darkening sky above. The maze seemed alive, the shadows between the thick walls of greenery twisting and shifting as Harry moved cautiously forward. His heart pounded in his chest, every step sending a shiver down his spine. It was disorienting, and every corner looked the same, adding to the sense of dread that gnawed at him. His wand was clenched tightly in his hand, but the further he went, the more he felt like it might be useless. There was no sound except his own breathing and the steady crunch of grass beneath his feet. The hedges stretched impossibly high above him, blocking out most of the fading light. Harry moved through the winding paths, trying to steady his breathing, but there was no shaking the cold, creeping fear that crawled up his spine. The maze was playing tricks on his mind, whispering promises of danger at every turn. He kept his wand raised, ready, but there were no creatures here, no obvious threats, just the oppressive feeling of being utterly alone. Idly, he thought about how utterly pointless the tournament must have been for the audiences. Sure, the first task surely was a spectacle to behold, fighting dragons and whatnot. The second? Staring at the cold, gray surface of the lake for an hour? Who even came up with that? And here he was inside a maze with hedges magically insulating him from the outside world. Were the audience just sitting there, looking at shrubbery for who knows for how long? How utterly pointless. Every so often, a distant crackle of magic told him one of the other champions had triggered something, perhaps a spell or a trap, but it only made Harry walk faster. The sense of urgency was building inside him, pressing against his chest like a vice. After what felt like an eternity, Harry rounded a final corner and came to a halt. His breath caught in his throat. There, in the center of a small clearing, stood the gleaming Triwizard Cup, illuminated in a soft silver glow. There was a faint feeling of disappointment, intermingling with everything else. That's it? It looked almost peaceful in contrast to the dark, twisted maze surrounding it. But Harry knew better. His heart pounded as he took a step forward, then another. Every instinct in him screamed to stop, to turn back, but he knew this was it. The real test wasn't surviving the maze. It was what came next. The cup was only a few feet away now, its surface reflecting the faint light of the moon above. Harry's chest tightened. Dumbledore's words echoed in his mind. The only way to defeat Voldemort is by surrendering willingly. He stopped just short of the cup, his hand hovering in the air, mere inches from it. His breathing was shallow, and he could feel the tension building, the weight of what was about to happen pressing down on him. If he touched the cup, it would begin, a ritual that would bring Voldemort back. And Harry knew that if he wanted to stand any chance at defeating him, at ruining his ritual, he had to go along with it. He had to let them take him, let them draw his blood willingly. Harry's hand trembled as he reached out toward the cup. His heart was racing now. He looked quickly at the watch Dumbledore had given him, the safeguard that would ensure that no matter what, he would always have an out. But in this, he really had no choice. He squeezed his eyes shut, bracing himself. With a final deep breath, Harry's hand closed around the handle of the Triwizard cup. There was a hard pull at his navel, and the world spun violently before Harry's feet touched solid ground again. His vision swam, and for a brief, confusing moment, he thought they had been returned to Hogwarts. But the familiar comfort of the Quidditch pitch was nowhere to be found. Instead, the first thing he saw was not tombstones or a graveyard, but a pair of glowing red eyes. They belonged to a snake-like face that sneered down at him, its lips twisted in a cruel, taunting smile. Voldemort was already back. Before Harry could react, a quick wave of Voldemort's wand left him disarmed. Wand ripped from his hand. Harry looked around. They were on some kind of stage, but it wasn't man-made. It was a natural feature, a rocky outcrop that rose above a massive crowd of hooded, masked figures, Death Eaters, their faces hidden behind cold, expressionless masks, watching with gleeful anticipation. High above them, the stars shone. Harry's heart pounded in his chest. With a viciously quick motion, Voldemort slashed his wand across the air, and a searing pain shot through Harry's wrist. The portkey fell uselessly to the ground, clattering at his feet. Mockingly, Voldemort whined in a baby's voice, "Help me." His red eyes gleamed with cold amusement. "Old fool." Voldemort turned from Harry, addressing the crowd of Death Eaters surrounding them. His voice, dripping with mockery, filled the air. Voldemort's cold, high-pitched voice broke the silence. "Welcome, Harry Potter." The words were drawn out, mocking, as if he had been waiting for this moment for years. Harry's mind was reeling, shock gripping him tight. What is this?" Voldemort's smile widened. "What? Were you expecting something different?" he hissed, his voice dripping with derision. Laughter echoed through the crowd, low and chilling. This isn't how Harry stammered, but the stars. His thoughts racing back to what Dumbledore had told him would unfold. The stars weren't supposed to be aligned yet. Voldemort's grin sharpened. "Ah yes, but of course the stars," he mocked. The crowd of Death Eaters burst out into raucous laughter. Voldemort's red eyes glinted with amusement. He faced his audience. "Naturally, I will rely on the stars." He continued in mock thoughtfulness. "I wonder what else about this plan Dumbledore told you about was nonsense." "To catch you all up to speed," Voldemort began, "Dumbledore, the greatest wizard, blah blah." He rolled his eyes, holding up a hand. "Relied on my grand plan to be, let's see." He extended one spindly finger. "Have the Office of International Magic Cooperation arrange a game for school children." He ticked off the first finger. "Kidnap the Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher, a renowned orator, by the way." Another finger. Voldemort gave a short, derisive laugh. "Replace him with a Death Eater, necessitating fooling Dumbledore for months, just so he could put the boy in the tournament." Another finger. "As a ruse to kidnap the boy who lived when he inevitably won." And then he extended the last finger, his smile twisting with amusement. "Use his blood for some silly Wiccan woodland witch ritual." Out of fingers, Voldemort flicked his hand dismissively, as if swatting away a fly. "How do you even come up with something so convoluted? Do we dance naked in the moonlight, too?" His laughter cut through the air, cold and cruel, joined by the sniggers of the masked figures surrounding them. Harry's stomach twisted with dread. It truly did feel silly, now that Voldemort had laid their assumption of his plans out bare. With an air of showmanship, Voldemort swung back around to face Harry, his pale face illuminated by the flickering light of torches. "Tell me, Potter," he sneered, "your relationship to Dumbledore. Would you call him a father figure? A mentor? He paused. That is some role model for you there, knowingly delivering you right into my hands. Harry's throat felt tight, his thoughts frozen. But the imposter, Harry managed to croak, his voice faint. Voldemort let out a sharp, contemptuous snort. He died playing a silly game. Do you think I concern myself with schoolyard tricks? Junior came to me last summer, wanting to settle a score with his dear old Auror friend. I let him play his little games. Voldemort's lip curled in a sneer. Do you think I deign involve myself with school games for children? A sickening sense of dread settled deep in Harry's chest. His mind racing. We would have taken you at King's Cross regardless, end of term. But having Dumbledore deliver you was just too delicious. It seems Junior's silly game paid off for us after all. Almost as an afterthought, Voldemort lazily waved his wand in Harry's direction. Crucio. Harry screamed. He screamed for a long time, and when the pain subsided, the ambient noise, he realized, was the laughter of the Death Eaters relishing his torture. Can you imagine what Dumbledore must be thinking right now? Voldemort's voice was casual, almost amused, as he strolled leisurely around Harry. Another flick of his wand sent a new wave of agony through Harry's body. It felt as though his bones were splintering inside him, snapping and grinding with every fresh pulse of pain. Harry gasped, his vision swimming as he writhed on the cold, damp ground. The world around him blurred, but Voldemort's voice remained clear, cutting through the haze of agony. The Aurors, Voldemort continued, his voice almost lighthearted, sent by him to search a graveyard, no sign of anything, and yet his treasured golden boy gone. Another curse tore through Harry's body. Crucio. The pain was indescribable, like fire and knives ripping through his nerves, but worse, far worse. His muscles seized, and he twisted on the ground, trying to fight it, trying to hold on. He could hear the distant sound of Voldemort's mocking laughter, and the crowd of Death Eaters stood in utter silence, watching with blank, expressionless faces beneath their masks. Nobody, Voldemort's voice dropped to a hiss, save that dog uncle of yours, knows you're here. Because you were a good boy and kept your friends in the dark, weren't you? Harry clenched his eyes shut, trying to block out Voldemort's words, trying to escape into the darkness behind his eyelids. He could feel his body shaking, his heartbeat erratic. He couldn't think, he could barely breathe. No. Voldemort's voice came again, and this time softer. Imperio. He opened his eyes mechanically, staring straight ahead, no choice but to meet his tormentor's red eyes. That's better, Voldemort said with satisfaction. Crucio. The pain hit again, raw and vicious. His body convulsed on the ground, twisting and flailing as the curse ravaged him. His screams filled the silence, echoing in the empty air. I think my point has been made, Voldemort said softly, his voice cold and final. He raised his wand, his eyes gleaming with that terrible red light. Avada Kedavra, a blinding green flash, brighter than anything Harry had ever seen, filled his vision.